Picture a world at its peak, palaces glowing with painted frescoes, ships loaded with copper and tin, sailing between ports that had thrived for centuries, scribes in distant cities writing letters to kings they'd never met, coordinating trade networks that stretched from Greece to Egypt to the shores of modern-day Syria. This was the Late Bronze Age, and it was, in many ways, the first truly connected world. Then, within the span of a few decades, it all went quiet. Cities that had stood for hundreds of years burned and were never rebuilt. Trade routes that had functioned for generations simply stopped. Written records, the kind of detailed administrative archives that historians dream about, went silent almost everywhere at once. Great powers that seemed untouchable, empires with armies and monuments and centuries of history behind them, either collapsed entirely or were transformed beyond recognition. It's one of the strangest, most sudden vanishing acts in the historical record, and to this day nobody fully understands what happened. We give this collapse a date, 1177 BC. It sounds oddly specific for something so massive, doesn't it? Almost too precise for an event that swallowed an entire interconnected civilization. And that's because it is. 1177 BC isn't a single day when everything fell apart. There wasn't a meeting where the ancient world agreed to end on the same afternoon. Think of that date more like a marker, a symbolic point historians use to anchor a process that unfolded over years, maybe decades, across different regions at different speeds, for what were probably several overlapping reasons. It's a convenient flag planted in the timeline, not proof that some singular catastrophic event brought it all crashing down in an instant. But here's what makes this genuinely puzzling, the kind of puzzle that has kept archaeologists arguing for over a century. Around this general period, we see the Mycenaean palaces of Greece go dark. We see the mighty Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the ancient Near East, essentially disappear from the map. We see the bustling port city of Ugarit destroyed so suddenly that clay tablets were left baking in kilns, letters never delivered, warnings never heeded. Egypt survives, but only just, and never quite recovers its former power. And across the region, dozens of smaller kingdoms and cities that depended on this vast, interconnected trade network simply fade away. Why would so many different, powerful, seemingly stable civilizations, some of them rivals, some of them barely aware of each other's daily existence, fail within a relatively narrow window of time? That's the question we're going to sit with tonight. Not because we have a neat, tidy answer waiting at the end, but because the search itself, sifting through burned layers of ancient cities, decoding desperate letters written just before the end, comparing climate data pulled from ancient pollen and ice cores, is one of the most fascinating detective stories in all of archaeology. Before we go further, if you're listening to this in bed, drifting somewhere between awake and asleep, I'd love to know where you are and what time it is right there with you. I read these comments constantly, and there's something oddly comforting about picturing someone in Sydney at sunrise, someone in Chicago at midnight, all listening to the same quiet voice, pulling apart the mystery of a world that ended more than 3,000 years ago. And if you find these evenings with me valuable, the best way to support the show is completely free. Follow along on Spotify, and if you're enjoying yourself, leave a 5-star review. There's a link waiting for you in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Now, let's slow everything down. Let's walk calmly through the evidence, the mysteries and the competing theories, and see what the ancient world was actually trying to tell us before the lights went out. Let's start with something simple. Bronze. The metal that gave this entire age its name. It sounds almost mundane when you say it like that, just a metal. But bronze was, in a very real sense, the technology that built the ancient world's first version of globalization. And here's the thing about bronze that made it so powerful and so strange. It doesn't occur naturally. You can't just dig it out of the ground. Bronze is an alloy, copper mixed with a small amount of tin, and that simple fact created one of the most important geographic puzzles in human history. Copper deposits were relatively common. You could find them scattered across the Mediterranean world, in Cyprus, in parts of Anatolia, in the Sinai. But tin was rare, genuinely rare. The major sources lay far away, possibly in Central Asia, possibly in the Western Mediterranean, maybe even as far as Britain, though historians still debate exactly how far these trade lines stretched. What this meant, practically speaking, was that no single kingdom, no matter how powerful, could produce bronze entirely on its own. You needed access to distant mines, you needed ships, you needed merchants willing to cross seas and deserts. You needed treaties that would let foreign traders move safely through your territory. In other words, to make the weapons that armies carried, the tools that farmers used, the ornaments that nobles wore, you needed the cooperation of people hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away. This single material requirement quietly reshaped the politics of an entire region. It's easy to imagine the ancient world as a collection of isolated kingdoms, each minding its own affairs behind its own walls. But that picture is almost the opposite of the truth. By the late Bronze Age, sometime around the 14th and 13th centuries BC, Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the city-states of the Levant, the island kingdoms of Cyprus, the palace centres of the Aegean, and the great powers of Mesopotamia were all bound together in something that looked remarkably like an international system. Kings wrote letters to other kings. Diplomats crossed borders. Merchants moved goods along established sea routes and overland caravan paths that had been used for generations. This wasn't accidental contact, it was infrastructure. We actually have written proof of this. Clay tablets discovered at a site in Egypt called Amarna preserve diplomatic correspondence between pharaohs and the rulers of other great powers, kings addressing each other as brothers, discussing trade, marriage alliances, and occasionally complaining that the last shipment of gold was smaller than promised. It's a strange feeling reading these letters. You get royal courtesy and grand titles in one sentence, and then something almost petty and human in the next. It reminds you these weren't distant, abstract civilizations. They were real governments, run by real people, negotiating real problems just like governments do today. At the centre of most of these societies sat something historians call the palace economy. And this is worth slowing down on, because it explains so much of what came both before and after the collapse. In many Bronze Age kingdoms, the palace wasn't just a royal residence. It was the administrative heart of the entire economy. Grain harvests were collected and stored under palace authority. Skilled craftsmen, weavers, metalworkers, potters worked in workshops that were directly controlled or heavily supervised by the palace. Scribes kept meticulous records, tracking everything from bronze ingots to olive oil to the rations given to labourers. This was a remarkably centralised system, efficient in many ways, capable of organising large-scale building projects, supporting professional armies, and funding elaborate religious ceremonies. But it also meant that enormous amounts of economic activity depended on a relatively small number of decision-makers at the very top. And those decision-makers weren't just managing their own kingdoms. They were managing relationships with each other. This is where the story becomes almost glamorous, at least on the surface. Kings exchanged extraordinary gifts, gold vessels, ivory carvings, fine textiles, chariots, exotic animals, as displays of wealth and goodwill. Royal marriages linked distant dynasties together. An Egyptian pharaoh might marry a princess from Babylon or from one of the Syrian kingdoms, weaving royal bloodlines across enormous distances. Professional merchants, sometimes operating semi-independently, sometimes acting almost like state representatives, carried goods between ports, moving copper from Cyprus, tin from far-flung sources, fine Aegean pottery, Egyptian linen, Levantine wine, and Mesopotamian textiles along routes that had been refined over centuries. And then there were the messengers, the diplomats who crossed hostile borders under something like international protocol, carrying letters, negotiating disputes, arranging safe passage for merchant caravans. It's an oddly moving image if you think about it. Long before anything resembling a modern international system existed, these ancient courts had already worked out the basic mechanics of diplomacy. Formal titles, expected courtesies, even something resembling early trade agreements. All of this created something extraordinary. A world where a disruption in one region could genuinely be felt in another, thousands of miles away. Wealth flowed along these connections in astonishing quantities. Palaces grew larger. Art became more elaborate. Trade goods travelled farther than ever before. Shipwrecks discovered off the coast of modern Turkey, still resting on the seafloor after more than 3,000 years, show just how vast and interconnected this trading world had become. Cargo holds packed with copper and tin ingots, exotic materials from Africa, pottery from Cyprus and the Aegean, all travelling together on a single vessel. But interdependence is a double-edged thing, isn't it? The same connections that allowed wealth and innovation to spread so efficiently also meant that a shock in one part of the system could ripple outward into places that had nothing directly to do with the original problem. If tin shipments were disrupted, bronze production could stall everywhere at once. If one major trading partner collapsed, the merchants, craftsmen, and palace administrators who depended on that relationship might suddenly find themselves without the resources they needed to keep their own systems running. A network built for efficiency and shared prosperity was also, almost by definition, a network vulnerable to shared collapse. So as we move forward into what actually happened around 1177 BC, keep this image in mind. Not isolated kingdoms falling one by one for entirely separate reasons, but a tightly woven system of palaces, ports, and trade routes, prosperous, sophisticated, and deeply, deeply interconnected. Because to understand why so much fell apart at once, we first need to understand just how tightly everything had been tied together in the first place. But now we need to pause over that date itself, 1077 BC. It has a powerful sound to it, doesn't it? A single year, fixed and dramatic, as if someone had looked at a calendar in the ancient world and written down, "This is when everything ended." But history almost never works that neatly. 1177 BC is not the exact date when every Bronze Age kingdom collapsed. It is not the moment every city was burned, every palace abandoned, every trade ship vanished beneath the waves. It is better understood as a marker, a date attached to one of the most famous surviving records from the end of the Bronze Age, the inscriptions of the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III. At his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile, Ramesses left a huge account of his victories. The walls show ships colliding in battle, archers fire from the decks. Enemy warriors tumble into the water. On land, Egyptian chariots charge against a mass of people moving with ox carts, women and children apparently travelling alongside armed men. The inscriptions describe foreign groups arriving from the north, peoples who had already, according to the Egyptian version, devastated lands across the eastern Mediterranean. This battle is traditionally dated to around 1177 BC, in the 8th year of Ramesses III's reign. And because it sits near the centre of a much larger period of destruction, abandonment, migration, and political upheaval, that date has become shorthand for the end of an age. But shorthand can be dangerous. Imagine looking at a forest after a massive storm. Some trees fell in the first hour, others survived for weeks, damaged but standing. Some died later from disease or drought, some bent in the wind and recovered. If you chose one dramatic photograph from the middle of that storm, you might call it the day the forest died. But that photograph would not tell the whole story. That is what the Revel 11,077 BC is. A dramatic photograph from the middle of a long crisis. The real chronological frame stretches much wider, roughly from 1250 to 1100 BC. That's about a century and a half, long enough for children born into a prosperous palace world to grow old in a very different one. Long enough for a kingdom to suffer crop failures, lose trade partners, fight expensive wars, survive one invasion, and then fall to another. Long enough for some cities to burn and be rebuilt, while others were abandoned so completely that grass grew over their streets. And even those dates are not as exact as they look. Dating the late Bronze Age is one of those problems that seems simple until you get close to it. Archaeologists excavate a destroyed city and find ash, collapsed walls, broken pottery, arrowheads, storage jars, perhaps a tablet baked hard by the fire that destroyed the building around it. That destruction layer tells us something major happened, but it does not always tell us exactly when. Pottery styles can narrow the date down. Imported objects can connect a layer to another kingdom's timeline. Radiocarbon dating can provide a range. Written records can sometimes name kings or mention wars. But all of these tools come with uncertainty. A jar may have been used for decades before the house burned. A king may have ruled longer or shorter than later chronologies suggest. A radiocarbon date may give us a window of years rather than one precise afternoon. And ancient rulers, it must be said, were not always neutral reporters. When Ramesses III carved his victory on a temple wall, he was not writing a modern history textbook. He was presenting himself as the defender of Egypt, chosen by the gods, defeating enemies who threatened cosmic order itself. That does not mean the battle was invented. There is no reason to doubt that Egypt faced a serious attack. But it does mean we should read the inscription carefully. Ramesses had every reason to make the danger sound enormous, and every reason to make his victory sound total. Still, the broad pattern is impossible to ignore. Across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, major centres suffered extraordinary disruption around the end of the 13th and beginning of the 12th century BC. The Mycenaean palace centres of Greece, places like Pylos, Mycenae and Tiryns, were damaged, destroyed or transformed. The Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the age, disappeared from central Anatolia. Its capital, Hattusa, was abandoned. Ugarit, a wealthy port city on the Syrian coast, was destroyed, leaving behind final letters that seemed to capture a government in panic. Cyprus, which had supplied so much of the copper holding the Bronze Age economy together, experienced upheaval and destruction at several important sites. In the Levant, old cities fell, new populations arrived, and political maps that had existed for centuries began to dissolve. That is the part of the story people mean when they say civilization collapsed. But the phrase can create a misleading picture. It makes it sound as if the entire known world went dark in one synchronized catastrophe. It didn't. Egypt was battered, threatened, and under immense internal strain, but it did not vanish in 1177 BC. Ramesses III's kingdom survived, the attacks described at Medinet Habu. Egyptian administration continued, temples continued operating, farmers continued planting along the Nile, but Egypt emerged weaker than before, increasingly unable to project power into the Levant, and increasingly troubled by economic problems, labour unrest, and political instability. Further east, Assyria survived too. It faced its own pressures and periods of contraction, but it remained a political force. Babylon continued, though it also endured conflict and disruption. Elam, in what is now southwestern Iran, did not simply disappear into the same wave of destruction either. These states remind us that the late Bronze Age collapse was never universal. It was regional, connected, and devastating, but uneven. Even within regions that suffered badly, survival was rarely a simple yes or no. A palace could fall while villages nearby continued. A city might be destroyed, then reoccupied by different people. A trade route could fail in one generation and reopen in another, altered but not gone. The disappearance of a royal court did not mean the disappearance of everyone who had lived under it. Farmers, shepherds, craftspeople, fishers, and small communities kept going, often in harder circumstances and with fewer protections than before. And in some places the collapse created opportunities. When the old palace systems broke apart, smaller communities gained room to organize themselves. New settlements appeared in highlands and borderlands. New political identities formed. Iron, once rare and difficult to work, gradually became more important. Maritime groups found new openings as the old royal navies and trading monopolies weakened. The world after the collapse was poorer in some ways, less centralized and often more violent. But it was not empty. It was changing. So when we say 1177 BC, we should hear more than a date. We should hear the echo of Egyptian war drums. Yes. We should think of Ramesses III standing before carved images of defeated enemies, claiming that Egypt had held the line. But we should also remember that, elsewhere, the line had already broken. Some kingdoms had fallen years earlier. Others would struggle on for decades. Some people fled. Some fought. Some adapted. Some may not even have understood that they were living through the end of an age. That is the strange thing about collapse. People inside it rarely experience it as a chapter heading. They experience it as missing grain shipments, as a letter that never receives an answer, as refugees arriving at the gate, as a palace demanding more taxes when the harvest has failed, as smoke on the horizon, as the realization that the king who promised protection can no longer protect anyone. And nowhere is that realization clearer than in Greece, where the great Mycenaean palaces, centres of wealth, bureaucracy and royal power, began to meet the fires that would end their world. Imagine standing on a hill in southern Greece around 1250 BC. Below you, fields of barley and wheat move in the wind. Goats and sheep pick their way across the slopes. Roads lead toward a great fortified complex of stone walls, storerooms, workshops, shrines, courtyards, and royal chambers. At the centre of it all is the palace. This is the Mycenaean world. Not one united Greek kingdom, not yet anything like the Greece of Athens and Sparta that would come much later, but a patchwork of powerful palace states. Mycenae in the Argolid, Tiryns only a short distance away, Pylos on the western coast of the Peloponnese, Thebes in central Greece. There were other important centres too, including Orchomenos, Iolkos, and perhaps Athens. But these major palaces dominated their regions through a combination of military force, religion, land management, trade, and bureaucracy. And they were built to look permanent. At Mycenae, enormous walls enclosed the citadel. Later Greeks looked at those blocks, some weighing many tons, and decided ordinary humans could never have built them. They called them Cyclopean, because only the Cyclopes, the giant one-eyed beings of myth, seemed strong enough to move stones like that. The famous Lion Gate stood at the entrance, with two carved lions or lionesses rising above the doorway, a warning and a declaration. Whoever entered this place was entering the domain of a king. Inside were elite houses, tombs, storerooms, and the remains of a palace centred on a megaron, a great hall with a central hearth. The ruler, often called the Wonax in the palace records, would have received officials, overseen ceremonies, distributed goods, and made decisions that affected thousands of people living far beyond the walls. At Tiryns, the fortifications were even more astonishing. Thick stone walls wrapped around the hilltop. Passageways ran through the masonry. The palace was smaller than Mycenae in some ways, but it was still a centre of concentrated power, carefully planned and heavily defended. Then there was Pylos, the palace associated by later Greek tradition with the legendary king Nestor. It was not enclosed by massive cyclopean walls in the same way as Mycenae and Tiryns, but it was no minor settlement. The Palace of Nestor, as archaeologists call it, was a large organised administrative centre overlooking the western Peloponnese. It had painted rooms, storerooms packed with jars, workshops and archives. It controlled land, animals, textiles, metal, religious offerings and labour. Thebes, farther north in Boeotia, was another major power. Its palace lay beneath the modern city, which makes excavation difficult. But enough has survived to show that Thebes was deeply tied into the Mycenaean system. It had administrative records, wealthy burials, imported goods, and the same basic machinery of palatial rule. These places were not just royal residences, they were command centres. The clearest evidence comes from thousands of small clay tablets written in Linear B. At first glance, they don't look very dramatic. They are not heroic poems. They do not tell us about battles between gods and kings. Most were never meant to last. Palace scribes used wet clay for temporary records, then stored the tablets away. Under normal circumstances, the clay would eventually have crumbled back into dust. But when palaces burned, the fire baked the tablets hard. The destruction that erased the institutions also preserved their paperwork. And what paperwork it was! Linear B tablets list sheep by the hundreds. They record women and children assigned to textile work. They track bronze, wheels, chariots, oil, grain, perfume, hides, cloth, land allotments, religious offerings, and groups of labourers whose names or origins were carefully noted. At Pylos, scribes recorded coastal watch duties, perhaps because officials feared danger arriving by sea. They noted bronze being collected or allocated apparently for weapons. They kept close track of who owed what to the palace, and what the palace owed in return. This was not a simple world of farmers bringing a little grain to a king once a year. It was a tightly managed system. The palace sat at the centre of a web. Villages produced food and animals, craftspeople made cloth, pottery, tools and luxury goods. Officials counted, collected, redistributed and recorded. Religious institutions received offerings. Elite households were supported. Military resources could be mobilized. The palace did not necessarily control every detail of ordinary life, but it reached into a remarkable number of areas. And that was its strength. It was also its weakness. Because a system organized around one central place can work beautifully when harvests are good, trade routes remain open, and officials can enforce their demands. But if that central place fails, the whole web can begin to unravel fast. Around the end of the 13th century BC, that is exactly what happened. Pylos burned, probably around 1180 BC, though the exact date remains debated. The destruction was severe. Roofs collapsed, wooden beams caught fire, rooms filled with ash and debris. The palace was not rebuilt. Its final tablets, preserved by the blaze, seem to capture administration in its last moments. There are references to watchers along the coast and to military preparations. It is tempting to see these as proof of an imminent invasion. Maybe they were, but caution is necessary. A kingdom could organize coastal defences because of piracy, local raiding, political tension, or fears that never became a full-scale attack. The tablets tell us people were worried. They do not give us the name of the enemy who destroyed the palace. Mycenae and Tiryns also suffered destructive episodes around this broad period. At Mycenae, damage and rebuilding occurred, and the citadel continued for a time in altered form. Tiryns too survived longer than Pylos, though it was transformed by the crises of the early 12th century. Thebes experienced destruction and disruption near the end of the Bronze Age, although its archaeological story is complicated by later building and incomplete excavation. This matters because there was no single neat event called the Fall of Mycenaean Greece. Different palace centres had different endings, some burned suddenly. Some were damaged and repaired. Some may have endured political instability before their final decline. Some settlements outside the palace centres may have experienced the crisis as a slow worsening rather than one terrifying night of fire. So what caused the fires? The honest answer is that we don't know. Not completely. Attack is an obvious possibility. Fortifications, weapons, destruction layers, and the apparent concern for coastal defence all suggest that violence was part of the world these people lived in. Raiders from the sea, rival Greek kingdoms, invaders from beyond the Aegean, or armed groups moving through a fractured landscape could all have played a role. But attack alone may not explain everything. A palace could also be vulnerable to internal revolt. These societies were hierarchical. The wanaks and elite officials sat at the top. Below them were local leaders, soldiers, priests, craftspeople, farmers, herders, enslaved people, and dependent labourers. In a time of food shortages, taxes, military demands, or failed trade, resentment could become dangerous. We have no tablet from Pylos saying, "The people have risen against us." Ancient records almost never give us that kind of direct confession. But political fragmentation is entirely possible. A kingdom under stress can break apart from the inside before an enemy ever reaches the gate. Accidental fires are possible too. Palaces contained oil, timber, textiles, stored grain, workshops, and open hearths. They were full of flammable material. An accident might destroy one building. But when multiple centres show disruption across a wider region, accident becomes less satisfying as the whole explanation. Environmental stress may have made every other problem worse. A run of poor harvests could reduce palace income. Drought could strain food supplies. Earthquakes could damage buildings, roads, and storage facilities. Disrupted trade could cut off luxury materials, and more importantly, copper and tin needed for bronze. The palace system had grown powerful by coordinating resources across wide distances. That meant it could also become dangerously dependent on those connections. Think of it like a great machine with many gears. Grain from one region, wool from another, bronze from overseas, ships carrying oil, timber, pottery and cloth, scribes recording every movement, guards protecting roads and coasts, a king at the centre issuing orders. If one gear breaks, the machine may keep turning. If several break at once, the whole thing begins to grind itself apart. By about 1100 BC, the palace system was gone. Linear B writing disappeared from Greece. The great central archives fell silent. Monumental palace construction ended. Long-distance trade shrank sharply. Population patterns changed. Some people moved into more defensible hilltop settlements. Others may have left their homes entirely. The world became smaller, more local, and in many places poorer. But Greece did not disappear. That is the crucial point. The farmers did not vanish when the palace scribes stopped writing. Shepherds still took flocks into the hills. Fishers still worked the coasts. Potters still shaped clay. Families still buried their dead, married, argued, traded, prayed, and tried to feed their children. Some communities survived near the old centres, others relocated. New villages formed where palace officials no longer collected grain or commanded labour. The palace had been one way of organising society. It was not society itself. And after the fires, people began building different ways to live. Smaller, less centralized, often more insecure, but adaptable. The great citadels of Mycenaean and Tiryns still stood over the landscape, blackened in places, repaired in others, reminders of a world that had promised order and protection. For generations afterward, people must have looked up at those huge walls and wondered what had happened to the kings who once ruled behind them. Then, across the Aegean and beyond, another great power was facing an even more complete disappearance. In central Anatolia, the Hittite Empire was about to lose not just a palace, but its capital, its royal line, and almost its entire place in history. The Hittites were not a small kingdom waiting nervously at the edge of someone else's map. They were one of the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, a rival of Egypt, a force that could send armies across mountains, negotiate treaties with kings hundreds of miles away, and control a territory stretching across much of Anatolia into northern Syria. Their capital was Hattusa. Today it lies in central Turkey, in a landscape of rolling hills, rocky outcrops, and broad valleys. But around 1250 BC, Hattusa was one of the most formidable cities in the known world. Massive stone walls ran for miles around the settlement. Gates decorated with lions, sphinxes, and warriors guarded the approaches. Temples stood among administrative buildings, storerooms, workshops, and royal compounds. There were reservoirs, granaries, paved roads, and enough official space to manage an empire. And beneath the ruins there were archives, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets written mostly in Hittite cuneiform, survived because they were baked hard in ancient fires or preserved under collapsed buildings. They record treaties, laws, prayers, land grants, religious rituals, royal letters, military orders, court cases, and diplomatic messages. The Hittites wrote about everything. They wrote to their gods. They wrote to foreign kings. They wrote down old traditions, legal disputes, omens, and instructions for festivals so complicated they could make modern tax forms look relaxing. This gives Hattusa an unusual voice. We do not have to guess that it was a centre of government. The tablets show us the machinery turning. The Hittite king was more than a warlord in a palace. He stood at the centre of an administrative and religious system that connected distant provinces, vassal rulers, military commanders, temple officials, and royal relatives. Orders moved outward from Hattusa. Taxes, tribute, troops, goods, and information moved inward. A ruler in northern Syria might govern locally, but he did so within a web of Hittite treaties and obligations. Cities like Carchemish, Aleppo, and Ugarit were tied in different ways to the imperial system. At its height, the empire had faced Egypt itself. In the 13th century BC, the Hittite king Muwatalli II fought Ramesses II of Egypt at the famous Battle of Kadesh. Neither side got the total victory it wanted. Both claimed success, naturally. Ancient kings were not famous for issuing statements that began, "Well, that could have gone better." But the battle ended with neither empire destroyed, and later the Hittites and Egyptians made peace. Their treaty, one of the earliest surviving international peace agreements, divided influence in Syria and created a balance between two superpowers. For a while the Hittite Empire looked secure, but secure is not the same as stable. An empire as large and connected as Hatti needed food, loyalty, roads, messengers, soldiers, and predictable provinces. It needed its royal family to avoid tearing itself apart. It needed distant vassals to keep paying tribute. It needed the mountain peoples beyond its northern frontier to stay quiet. It needed trade routes through Syria and Anatolia to remain open. It needed harvests good enough to feed not only farmers, but cities, armies, temple staff, craftsmen, and the officials who counted everyone else's grain. That is a lot of things that have to keep working. The Hittites had always faced pressure along their borders. To the north were the Kaska peoples, groups beyond the Black Sea mountains who repeatedly raided or challenged Hittite control. In the west, Hittite kings dealt with unstable territories and ambitious local rulers. In the south and east, Syria was wealthy but politically complicated, filled with vassal kingdoms that could become allies, burdens, or battlegrounds. And inside the royal court, succession could be dangerous. The Hittite state had survived royal rivalries before. Kings were deposed, princes competed, branches of the royal family controlled important territories. Under King Tudaliya IV, there were tensions involving his relative Kurunta, ruler of Hattusa in southern Anatolia. The details are murky, but the larger pattern is clear enough. Even at the height of imperial power, the Hittite royal house was not an unbreakable block. It was a family, which in ancient politics often meant a collection of people with armies, claims, grudges, and very sharp knives. Then, near the end of the 13th century BC, the pressure seems to have intensified. Hittite texts and letters from their wider worlds suggest serious problems with food. There is evidence of grain being moved over long distances to help supply parts of the Hittite realm. Egyptian records also refer to grain shipments headed toward Hittite-controlled areas. This does not prove a single empire-wide famine. Ancient states moved grain for many reasons. But it strongly suggests that food security had become a major concern. Imagine the problem from Hattusa's point of view. A bad harvest in one region is difficult. A bad harvest across several regions is political. Grain stores shrink, prices rise, villages struggle. Soldiers still need rations, temples still expect offerings. Provinces that cannot feed themselves become less able and less willing to support the king. Every shortage becomes an argument about who gets fed first. And then there were the provinces. The Hittite Empire did not collapse because one enemy smashed through one gate. Its outer territories may already have been slipping away before the capital fell silent. In western Anatolia, in Syria, and along contested frontiers, local rulers had their own interests. Communication could fail. Garrisons could be cut off. Vassals could change sides, stop sending resources, or simply focus on surviving their own emergencies. The final known Hittite king was Suppiluliuma II. His inscriptions describe military campaigns, including conflicts in southwestern Anatolia and at sea near Cyprus. They sound like the words of a king still trying to project control. But royal inscriptions always do. A ruler does not carve. The situation is becoming extremely complicated, and several provinces have stopped returning my letters. He carves victories. Soon after, Hattusa was abandoned. That word matters, abandoned. The city shows evidence of destruction and burning in parts of the site, but the story does not look like a simple one-night massacre frozen in ash. There is evidence that valuables and portable objects were removed. Some buildings may have been emptied before they burned. The population appears to have left in stages, or at least not all at once. The great walls still stood. The temples were still there. The archives remained, but the administrative heart of the empire was gone. Perhaps Hattusa had become impossible to supply. Perhaps enemies threatened from multiple directions. Perhaps the royal court had moved elsewhere during a political crisis. Perhaps provinces had broken away, leaving the capital isolated. Perhaps fire came after abandonment, started by attackers, squatters, accident, or deliberate destruction. The archaeology gives us fragments. It does not give us a final eyewitness report. What we can say is that by around 1200 BC, the Hittite imperial centre had ceased to function. A state that had negotiated as an equal with Egypt vanished from its capital. Its royal line disappears from the historical record. Its palace bureaucracy stopped producing the vast archives that had once documented every treaty, ritual, and shipment. Hattusa was never rebuilt as the capital of a new Hittite Empire. But the Hittites did not simply disappear. In southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, smaller kingdoms survived or emerged from the wreckage. Carchemish, once an important Hittite-controlled centre on the Euphrates, continued as a powerful regional state. Other Neo-Hittite kingdoms appeared at places like Melid, Carchemish, Samal and Tabal. Many used Luwian hieroglyphic writing rather than the old imperial cuneiform. They preserved Hittite traditions, royal titles, gods, art styles and political memories, even as they adapted to a new world. The empire was gone. The people, languages and local states remained. And that is one of the strangest things about collapse. From far away, it can look like a civilization vanished. Up close, it is usually more complicated. Capitals fall. Archives go quiet. Kings lose their thrones. But farmers remain in their valleys. Craftsmen keep working. Local rulers make new alliances. Old identities survive in altered forms. Hattusa was not the end of Anatolia. It was the end of one enormous experiment in ruling it. And farther south on the Syrian coast, another city was watching that experiment fail in real time. Its people were writing desperate letters, asking for help that may never have come. Ugarit was not an imperial capital like Hattusa. It was something different, and in some ways more vulnerable. It was a port city on the Syrian coast, near modern Ras Shamra, looking out across the eastern Mediterranean. From there, ships could reach Cyprus, Anatolia, Egypt, the Levant, and the islands of the Aegean. Caravans arriving from inland Syria and Mesopotamia could bring goods down to the harbour. Ships could carry those goods outward again. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant sources, luxury textiles, olive oil, wine, timber, ivory, pottery, gold, silver, grain, horses, dyes, finished bronze goods, raw materials for making more bronze goods. The things kings gave each other, temples demanded, merchants sold, and armies needed. Ugarit was wealthy because it sat in the middle of that movement. And Ugarit wrote things down. The city contained archives of clay tablets in several languages and scripts. There were texts in Ugaritic, the local language, written in an alphabetic cuneiform script. There were Akkadian tablets, the diplomatic language of the age. There were texts in Hurrian and Hittite, along with Egyptian and Cypriot connections appearing in the records. There were royal letters, trade agreements, legal documents, tax records, rituals, myths, lists of goods and messages sent between rulers. If Hattusa lets us see the administrative machinery of an empire, Ugarit lets us hear the nervous conversations of a trading city caught in a world coming apart. Its final letters are among the most haunting documents of the Bronze Age collapse. One of them was sent by Amurapi, the last known king of Ugarit, to the ruler of Wallachia, probably Cyprus. Amurapi describes enemy ships appearing off the coast. He says that his cities were burned and terrible things had been done in his country. Then comes the detail that makes the letter feel almost painfully immediate. Ugarit's army, he says, was away in Hittite territory. Its ships were away in the land of Lucca, on the southern coast of Anatolia. The king was looking out toward danger from the sea, and many of the people who might have defended him were somewhere else, serving obligations to the Hittite world. Think about that for a moment. Ugarit was a maritime city. It depended on ships. It depended on alliances. It depended on a larger political system in which a vassal king was expected to supply soldiers, sailors, tribute, and support when his imperial overlord demanded it. That system had probably made Ugarit rich. Now it may have left the city exposed. Hammurapi's letter is not a calm report written after the crisis. It reads like a request from inside the crisis. Enemy ships had come. The defences were thin. Help was needed. Whether help ever arrived, we do not know. Another text, sent by an official connected with Cyprus, warns Ugarit to be alert. Enemy vessels had been seen. The message tells them to strengthen defences, to watch for hostile forces. It is the sort of warning that sounds simple until you remember the setting. This was not an age of instant communication. A warning had to be written on wet clay, carried to a harbour, loaded onto a ship, or passed along roads, and delivered through whatever territory remained safe enough to cross. By the time the tablet arrived, the enemy might already have been visible from the walls. And then, around the early 12th century BC, Ugarit was destroyed. The city was burned, buildings collapsed, archives were buried beneath debris. Objects were left where they fell. The destruction was severe enough that Ugarit, unlike some damaged cities of the period, was not rebuilt on the same scale. Its old palace administration ended. Its international correspondence stopped. The ports that had once linked kingdoms across the sea went quiet. Ironically, the fire that marked the end helped preserve its voice. Clay tablets are fragile when they are merely dried, but when a building burns, the heat can bake them hard. The same disaster that destroyed Ugarit's archives turned many of its records into durable artifacts. 3,000 years later, archaeologists recovered letters that had been waiting under the ruins, messages from a society that may have been destroyed before some of its officials even received the replies. That is why Ugarit matters so much. At many Bronze Age sites we see destruction layers: ash, broken walls, burned beams, abandoned rooms. These are powerful clues, but they do not speak. At Ugarit, the ruins speak back. Not clearly enough to answer every question, but clearly enough to show fear, pressure, and a government struggling to understand what was happening beyond its coastline. Still, the letters have limits. They do not tell us exactly who the attackers were. The phrase enemy ships is not a name. It does not say these were the Sea Peoples or these were Mycenaean raiders, displaced communities from Anatolia, pirates from the islands, rebels from nearby coasts, or a coalition of several different groups. Later Egyptian texts mention peoples arriving or fighting by land and sea, and it is tempting to fit every burning city into that story. But Ugarit's tablets do not give us a neat label for the men on those ships. They also do not prove that a single naval assault destroyed the city. Ugarit may have faced attacks from the sea. It may have faced danger from land as well. It may have been weakened by food shortages, disrupted trade, political obligations to the Hittites, and the general collapse of regional authority. A city can be attacked because it is weak, but it can also become weak because every system it relied upon is failing at once. And Ugarit relied on systems. Its wealth came from Mediterranean exchange. Its bronze economy needed imported copper and tin. Its palace needed merchants, sailors, scribes, foreign partners, and safe routes. Its king needed protection from the Hittite Empire, but also needed to send forces away when the empire called. Its harbour connected it to the world. That connection was its strength. Then the sea became dangerous. The great powers stopped looking reliable, and trade routes began to look less like lifelines and more like open doors. For Ugarit, the Bronze Age collapse was not an abstract event marked on a timeline. It arrived as a tablet pressed into clay, a warning from Cyprus, a plea for aid, ships on the horizon, an army somewhere else, and then silence. But silence did not fall everywhere. South of the Levant, beyond the Sinai deserts and the fortified roads leading toward the Nile, Egypt was still standing. It was one of the oldest and most powerful kingdoms in the eastern Mediterranean. Its temples were wealthy. Its bureaucracy was immense. Its armies had experienced fighting in Canaan, Nubia, and Libya. Its pharaoh, Ramesses III, ruled from a court that still spoke the language of empire. Egypt had survived crises before. It had watched rival powers rise and fall. And when the wider Bronze Age world began to fracture, Egypt did not disappear in the way that Ugarit and Hattusa disappeared. But survival is not the same thing as victory. During the reign of Ramesses III, probably beginning around 1184 BC, Egypt faced pressure from several directions. There were conflicts on its western frontier with Libyan groups. There were threats in the Levant, and there were movements of people by land and sea that Egyptian texts describe in dramatic terms. The most famous account appears carved on the walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile near Thebes. The temple is enormous. Its stone walls show the pharaoh towering over defeated enemies, drawing a bow from his chariot, striking captives, receiving tribute, and presenting victory to the gods. The inscriptions describe a moment of danger not only for Egypt, but for the whole region. They say that foreign lands had been disturbed, that countries had been cut off, that enemies had moved from island and coastal regions, that they came with families, wagons, and ships. Then comes the claim that Egypt stopped them. According to the inscriptions, Ramesses III fought a battle by land in the Levant, probably somewhere in the approaches to Egypt, and another battle at the mouths of the Nile. The reliefs show Egyptian archers firing from the shore, while enemy ships crowd together in the water. Some vessels appear to be colliding. Men fall overboard. Egyptian soldiers seize survivors on land. Enemy carts and ox-drawn wagons appear alongside armed fighters. It is one of the most vivid military scenes left from the entire Bronze Age, and it has shaped how later generations imagined the collapse. For a long time, the obvious reading seemed almost too perfect. A wave of invaders swept across the eastern Mediterranean, destroyed cities, ended empires, and finally crashed into Egypt. Ramesses III defeated them at the Nile. Egypt survived because its army was stronger, its defences were better, and its pharaoh was equal to the crisis. There is probably some truth in that picture. Egypt really did face enemies. There really were military campaigns. The Medinet Habu reliefs were not invented out of nothing. Archaeology and written records from across the region show a world under severe stress, with settlements destroyed, populations moving, and long-distance connections breaking down. Egypt's frontier defences mattered. Its soldiers mattered. Its fleet, whether operating at sea or in the protected waters of the delta, mattered. But the walls of Medinet Habu are not a neutral news report. They are royal inscriptions. Their purpose was to show that Ramesses III had protected Egypt, restored cosmic order, defeated chaos, and pleased the gods. Egyptian kings had been presenting themselves this way for centuries. A pharaoh was not supposed to look uncertain. He was not supposed to admit that supply systems were failing, that officials were corrupt, that grain was scarce, or that enemies had forced the kingdom into a defensive struggle. He was supposed to be victorious. So when the inscriptions say that the enemy lands were destroyed, or that Ramesses III defeated them completely, historians have to read carefully. The account is valuable. It preserves names, images, and details that would otherwise be lost. But it is also political. It turns a complicated crisis into a story with a clear ending. Danger came, the king acted, Egypt won. Real history is usually less tidy. The people shown at Medinet Habu are often grouped together under the modern label Sea Peoples. The Egyptian texts name several groups, including the Peliset, Jekka, Shurden, Denyen, and Weshesh. Some may have come from the Aegean, Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, or other parts of the Mediterranean. Some may have been raiders, Some may have been displaced farming communities. Some may have served as mercenaries before becoming enemies. Some may have been groups Egypt had encountered for generations. The label makes them sound like one organized nation sailing under a single flag. They probably were not. What Egypt may have faced was a mixture of armed groups, migrants, refugees, opportunists and communities moving through a collapsing political landscape. The wagons in the reliefs matter because they suggest more than a simple pirate raid. These people were not necessarily arriving only to fight. At least some appear to have been travelling with households, possessions and dependents. That does not make them harmless. Desperate migrations can become invasions. Armed groups moving through hungry territories can devastate the places they enter. But it does mean that the crisis may have involved people fleeing collapse as well as causing it. Ramesses III's Egypt resisted. That is the central fact. The Nile Delta was difficult to conquer. Egypt had natural barriers, fortified approaches, deep agricultural resources, and a state apparatus still capable of mobilizing labor, food, weapons, ships, and soldiers. While Hattusa was abandoned and Ugarit was burned, the Egyptian royal court continued to function. Temples continued to receive offerings, scribes continued writing, pharaohs continued being buried in the Valley of the Kings. The kingdom did not fully fall, but Egypt's empire was weakening. For centuries, Egyptian kings had projected power northward into Canaan and southern Syria. They controlled strategic towns, demanded tribute, moved armies along the coast, and competed with the Hittites for influence in the Levant. By the early 12th century BC, that old imperial reach was becoming harder to maintain. The great cities and kingdoms that had anchored Egyptian diplomacy were disappearing. The Hittite Empire was gone. Ugarit was gone. Trade routes were unreliable. Garrison towns and vassal rulers could not be supported as easily as before. Egypt may have retained influence in parts of Canaan for a time, but it no longer dominated the northern Levant in the old Late Bronze Age way. It had survived the storm, but its world had shrunk, and inside Egypt the strain was becoming visible. Later in Ramesses III's reign, workers at the royal tomb village of Deir el-Medina went on strike after their grain rations were delayed. This is often described as the first recorded labour strike in history. The workers did not simply stop working because they were restless. They complained that they were hungry. The grain had not arrived. The system that fed a highly skilled state workforce had failed them, at least temporarily. There were also conspiracies at court. Ramesses III eventually faced a plot from within his own household, the so-called harem conspiracy. Documents suggest that officials, servants, and members of the royal family were involved in an attempt to replace him. The precise details remain uncertain, but the existence of the plot tells us something important. Even a kingdom that had defeated invaders could be vulnerable at its centre. Egypt's monuments still proclaimed strength. Its armies still won battles. Its bureaucracy still produced records. But beneath the stone inscriptions there were delayed rations, political rivalries, economic pressures, and an empire becoming more defensive than expansive. That is why Egypt is so important to this story. It shows that the Bronze Age collapse was not a single switch being turned off across the map. Not every state vanished in the same year. Not every city burned. Not every population fled. Some kingdoms endured, but endured in altered form. They lost territories. They lost trading partners. They spent more resources on defence. Their institutions continued, but under heavier strain. Egypt did not become a ruin like Ugarit. It became something more complicated, a survivor, and sometimes survivors carry the deepest scars, and that brings us back to the name that has become almost inseparable from the collapse itself, the Sea Peoples. It is a powerful phrase. It sounds like a single nation, a vast confederation of warriors from beyond the horizon, gathering ships, burning cities, toppling kingdoms, and moving relentlessly toward Egypt. But that picture is much cleaner than the evidence allows. Sea Peoples was not the name these groups gave themselves. It was not the name of a kingdom, an empire, or a united ethnic people. It is a modern scholarly shorthand created to gather together several foreign groups named in Egyptian records from the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. The Egyptians did not describe one enemy. They listed many. At Medinet Habu, the inscriptions of Ramesses III name the Peleset, the Cheka, the Shurdan, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. Other Egyptian texts from nearby periods mention groups with names such as the Luka, the Shekelish, and the Teresh. Some of these names may refer to communities Egypt had known for generations. The Shurdan, for example, appear in Egyptian sources before the reign of Ramesses III. At times they seem to have fought against Egypt. At other times they served in Egyptian armies. That matters. A people can be an enemy in one generation and a mercenary force in the next. A coastal group can raid ships in peacetime, fight for a king during war, settle as farmers after defeat, and become part of a new political order. The categories we like to use, pirate, soldier, refugee, migrant, invader, are not always separate in a collapsing world. Imagine a family living near a port on the coast of Anatolia or Cyprus. Trade has slowed. Grain is expensive. The ruler who once protected the roads can no longer pay his soldiers. Nearby towns have been attacked. Maybe an earthquake damaged buildings. Maybe drought has reduced harvests for several years. Maybe a rival army has taken control of the countryside. What do? Some stay and hope conditions improve. Some move inland, some seek protection behind city walls. Some join the soldiers of a local ruler. Some take to the sea because the sea is the one road still open. And some may discover that an armed boat can take food more quickly than trade can provide it. Now multiply that story across dozens of coastal communities. You do not get one neatly organized people. You get movement. You get fear. You get armed bands. You get desperate households travelling with carts, animals, children, and whatever possessions they can carry. You get local leaders trying to turn chaos into opportunity. You get soldiers who no longer receive rations and begin fighting for themselves. You get refugees who become conquerors, because the land ahead of them is occupied, and the land behind them is burning. That may be closer to what Egypt encountered. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show enemy fighters, but they also show ox carts carrying families and goods. This does not prove that every group was migrating with entire communities. Egyptian artists were making a political statement, not conducting an ethnographic survey. Still, the imagery is difficult to explain as nothing more than a naval raid. At least some of the people moving toward Egypt seem to have been trying to relocate. Where had they come from? That question has produced more theories than clear answers. The Peleset are often linked with the Philistines of the early Iron Age, who later appear in the southern Levant. Their material culture, especially some early pottery styles, shows connections with the Aegean world. This has led many scholars to suggest that at least part of their population had roots in or contacts with the Aegean. The Denyen have sometimes been connected to the Danaans, a name associated in later Greek tradition with Greeks. The Jekka have been linked by some researchers to places in western Anatolia, to Cyprus, or to coastal communities in the Levant. The Shurdan have often been associated with Sardinia, partly because the names sound similar. The Shekelish have been connected with Sicily. The Teresh have been connected with regions in Anatolia, or with later Etruscan traditions in Italy. But similarity in names is not proof. Ancient names travelled. They changed when written in Egyptian, Hittite, Akkadian, or later Greek. A group could be named after its homeland even after generations of migration. A military unit could preserve an old name long after its members came from somewhere else. And Egyptian scribes may have grouped very different people together because they fought in similar ways, arrived from similar directions, or simply looked foreign to the court recording them. So the map remains uncertain. Some sea peoples may have come from the Aegean, where Mycenaean palace society was collapsing. Some may have moved from western Anatolia, where Hittite power had weakened. Some may have come from Cyprus, an island deeply tied to copper trade and maritime exchange. Some may have roots in the central Mediterranean, some may already have lived along the Levantine coast. And some groups may have been mixed from the beginning, bound together not by shared ancestry, but by shared hunger, military service, or the chance to seize a new home. Think of a coalition rather than a nation. A coalition can form quickly under pressure. It does not need a common language, a common king, or a common past. It only needs a common direction. And during the final decades of the Bronze Age, many people had reasons to move. This is why the old story of the sea peoples destroying the entire Mediterranean world by themselves no longer satisfies most historians. The timing does not work neatly enough. Some cities were damaged or abandoned before the events recorded by Ramesses III. Some regions suffered no clear attack at all. The Hittite Empire was already under profound internal and external pressure. Mycenaean palaces fell in a pattern that cannot be explained simply by foreign ships arriving on Greek shores. Ugarit's final letters reveal danger, but they do not give us a complete list of attackers or a simple chain of command. The sea peoples were real, the names are real, the battles were real, migration and violence were real, but they were probably not the single cause of collapse. They may have been one force among many, or perhaps in some places they were not even a force acting from outside. They may have been people produced by the collapse itself, displaced communities moving through a world where states had failed, food was scarce, armies had splintered, and the old protections of empire no longer worked. In that sense, the sea peoples may be less like the beginning of the disaster than one of its most visible symptoms. A name carved in stone, a glimpse of human beings on the move, and behind them, across the eastern Mediterranean, the maritime crossroads that had connected kingdoms for centuries were beginning to break apart. And nowhere was that breakdown more important than along the shores of Canaan and Cyprus. For centuries these places had been the hinges of the eastern Mediterranean. Canaan, the strip of land along the Levantine coast, was crowded with ports, small kingdoms, farming towns, and inland routes leading toward Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Cyprus sat farther west, out in the sea like a great warehouse of copper. Between them moved ships loaded with metals, timber, oil, wine, pottery, cloth, ivory, glass, grain, and people. This was not the edge of the Bronze Age world. This was its busy centre. A ship leaving Egypt might sail north along the Canaanite coast, stopping at ports for water, food, cargo, or news. It could continue to Ugarit in northern Syria, cross to Cyprus for copper, then travel west toward the Aegean. Goods did not always move in one clean direction. Copper from Cyprus might be mixed with tin from far away to make bronze. Olive oil from the Levant could travel in jars made in Cyprus. Egyptian luxury goods might end up in a palace in Greece. Mycenaean pottery could appear in a house on the Syrian coast. The sea connected all of it, and when the sea became dangerous, unreliable, or simply too expensive to use, the damage spread far beyond the royal palaces. Cyprus was especially important because bronze requires copper, and Cyprus had copper in extraordinary quantities. Even its ancient name may be connected to the metal. The Romans called copper cuprum, probably after Cyprus. Long before Rome existed, late Bronze Age Cypriot communities were extracting ore from the island's mountains, smelting it, and sending the metal out across the Mediterranean in forms that were easy to transport. The famous oxhide ingots were part of this system, large slabs of copper shaped roughly like an animal hide, with handles at the corners. They could be stacked in ship holds, carried by workers, traded between merchants, and melted down wherever bronze was needed. A palace needed bronze for weapons, tools, chariot fittings, vessels, gates, and prestige goods. But so did everyone else. Farmers needed sickles and axes. Craftspeople needed cutting tools. Carpenters, masons, sailors, hunters, soldiers, and metalworkers all depended, in one way or another, on the movement of copper. So imagine what happened when that movement began to fail. Maybe ships were attacked. Maybe harbours were no longer secure. Maybe the rulers who organised mining expeditions could not pay workers or protect roads. Maybe foreign buyers stopped arriving because their own palaces had burned. Maybe drought reduced food supplies, making it harder to feed miners, sailors, and smelters. A copper mine is not useful if no one can transport the ore. A ship full of copper is not useful if no port will receive it. And a kingdom built around trade can become frighteningly fragile when trade disappears. The archaeological record in Cyprus shows disruption, but not one simple island-wide event. At places such as Enkomi, an important late Bronze Age centre on the eastern coast, archaeologists have found evidence of destruction and rebuilding around the end of the Bronze Age. Some buildings were damaged. Parts of the settlement were reorganised. Fortifications and new architectural forms appeared in later phases. But a burned layer does not come with a label. Fire can mean attack. It can mean accident. It can follow earthquake damage, internal conflict, or the abandonment of a building. Rebuilding can mean recovery, or it can mean that new people arrived and took over an old place. At Enkomi, as at many sites from this period, the evidence suggests turbulence. It does not hand us a single unquestionable story. Other Cypriot centres also changed. Some coastal settlements declined. Some inland locations may have become more attractive because they were easier to defend or closer to agricultural land. New communities emerged. Older ones were rebuilt in different forms. The island did not vanish. Its people adapted. But the commercial world that had made Cyprus so wealthy was being transformed. Across the water in Canaan, the pattern was just as uneven. Some cities were destroyed. Some were abandoned. Some survived with reduced populations. Some continued but under new rulers, new economic systems, or new cultural influences. The old map of powerful coastal city-states did not simply go dark all at once. It fractured. At Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron, on the southern Levantine coast, the early Iron Age eventually saw the emergence of communities often associated with the Philistines. Their pottery and some aspects of their material culture show links to the Aegean world, though those links do not tell us exactly who moved, how many arrived, or what happened to the people already living there. These were not empty lands waiting for settlers. They were landscapes full of farmers, fishers, herders, merchants, local rulers and families who had survived the breakdown of larger powers. New arrivals may have mixed with older populations. Some communities may have changed through migration. Others may have adopted foreign styles through trade, marriage, military service, or the simple prestige of new goods. Further north, older Phoenician cities such as Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre seem to have endured more successfully than some of their neighbours. Their survival would matter enormously in the centuries ahead. As the great palace economies faded, these coastal cities would help build new maritime networks. But in the immediate aftermath, survival did not mean prosperity. It meant adjusting to a smaller, harsher world. The change can be seen in settlement patterns. When large centres lose the ability to collect taxes, import food, command labour, and protect roads, people do not always remain behind their walls. Some move toward defensible hills, some scatter into smaller villages. Some gather around local strongmen, some leave the coast entirely. Others move toward it, hoping to find work, ships, or access to food. Old centres decline, new communities appear, trade routes shorten. Regional connections become more important than distant ones. And for ordinary people, this was not an abstract economic transition. It meant fewer imported tools, less copper, fewer ships arriving with grain when harvests failed, fewer markets where a potter could sell jars or a farmer could exchange oil for cloth. It meant sailors without cargoes, dock workers without wages, miners without buyers, and craftsmen without the raw materials that made their skills valuable. The collapse of maritime exchange did not stay on the water. It travelled inland through every road, workshop, granary, and household connected to the old system. And that is the strange weakness of a world bound together by trade. Connection can make a society rich. It can spread ideas, goods, techniques, and opportunities across enormous distances. But when the connections fail, the shock travels just as far. The Bronze Age had created a Mediterranean world of remarkable interdependence. Now one broken harbour at a time, one missing shipment at a time, one abandoned town at a time, that world was coming apart. This is where the Bronze Age world begins to look surprisingly familiar, not because it had factories, computers, or container ships. It did not, but because it depended on supply chains. A king in Mycenaean Greece could command a palace full of scribes, guards, bronze workers, chariot makers, weavers, cooks, and officials. But none of that organisation meant much if the palace could not get what it needed. Copper had to arrive often from Cyprus. Tin had to arrive from somewhere much farther away, perhaps Central Asia, Anatolia, Iran, or through a long chain of exchanges so complicated that no one person understood the whole route. Timber might come from the mountains of Lebanon or Anatolia, gold from Egypt or Nubia, ivory from Africa or Syria, glass, incense, dyed textiles, carved stone, exotic woods, fine pottery, and luxury objects from almost everywhere. And grain, perhaps most important of all, had to move when local harvests failed. The palaces were not just royal homes, they were distribution centres. They collected food from surrounding farms, recorded it on clay tablets, stored it in magazines, and sent it back out as rations. A worker might receive grain, a soldier might receive grain, a dependent family, a temple official, a bronze smith, a team of rowers preparing a ship. All might depend on the palace's ability to gather supplies from one place and move them somewhere else. This system could be enormously effective. In good years it concentrated wealth. It supported specialists who did not need to grow all of their own food. It allowed rulers to equip armies, build walls, maintain chariots, sponsor religious ceremonies, and reward loyal followers with imported treasures that proved they had access to the wider world. But it also created dependencies. A village that grew its own food and made most of its own tools could survive a great deal of isolation. Life would be hard, of course, but the village might continue. A palace economy was different. It had metalworkers who needed imported copper and tin. It had scribes whose work depended on taxes arriving. It had soldiers who needed weapons, rations, and commanders. It had elite households accustomed to imported goods. It had ships, ports, warehouses, merchants, caravan guards, dock workers, and craftsmen, all tied together by the expectation that next season, as last season, the shipments would come. And for a long time they did. One of the most extraordinary pieces of evidence comes from a shipwreck found off the coast of southern Turkey, near Uluburun. The ship sank around the late 14th century BC, before the final crisis of 1177 BC. But what it carried gives us a glimpse of the world that later became so vulnerable. Its cargo included roughly 10 tons of copper ingots, many of them in the familiar ox-hide shape. It also carried about a ton of tin. Together, those metals could have produced a huge quantity of bronze. There were jars of resin, probably used in perfumes or other luxury products. There was glass in vivid colours, ivory, ebony, gold objects, beads, tools, weapons, jewellery, pottery, and goods from regions separated by hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles. This was not a little fishing boat with a few local products. It was part of an international economy. Picture the journey behind a single ship's cargo. Copper mined in Cyprus, tin passing through many hands from a distant source, Canaanite jars filled with resin, Egyptian gold, Nubian ivory, glass made in workshops whose recipes were closely guarded, Mycenaean pottery, Levantine merchants, Anatolian ports, palace officials waiting at the far end for the goods to arrive. The Bronze Age was connected by thousands of arrangements like this. Some were direct exchanges between kings, some were gifts disguised as diplomacy. Some were tribute, some were private trade conducted by merchants under royal protection. Some may have moved through local markets and informal deals that left no written record. The important thing is that the system did not require every route to fail. It only required enough of them to become unreliable. If raiding increased at sea, merchants might refuse dangerous voyages. If a port was destroyed, ships had nowhere safe to unload. If drought caused famine, a kingdom might keep its grain rather than export it. If a ruler died, was overthrown, or lost control of the countryside, treaties and trade guarantees could disappear with him, and if one palace stopped buying, another part of the network felt the loss. A Cypriot mine could still contain copper, but miners needed food, smelters needed fuel, workers needed security, merchants needed customers. Ships needed crews and safe harbours. Bronze workers needed both copper and tin, not just one or the other. That is the cruel mathematics of specialisation. A bronze sword cannot be made from copper alone. A chariot force cannot function without wood, leather, horses, wheels, bronze fittings, food, and trained people to maintain all of it. A palace cannot feed its workers if taxes no longer arrive from damaged farms. And a hungry population may not remain patient while officials protect grain stores for the army or the royal household. Shortages could spread across society at once. Less metal meant fewer weapons and tools. Fewer tools could mean poorer harvests and slower rebuilding. Poorer harvests meant less grain for workers and soldiers. Less grain meant unrest, migration and pressure on the state. And a weaker state was less able to guard the roads, patrol the coast, protect merchants, or organise the next shipment. This is what historians often mean by systems collapse. Not one dramatic button being pressed, not necessarily one invasion, one earthquake, one drought, or one mysterious people appearing from the sea. A system can fail because several problems reinforce each other. A harvest shortfall makes trade more urgent. Dangerous trade makes shortages worse. Shortages weaken the government. A weaker government cannot respond effectively to rebellion, raiding, or disaster. Then the failure of one region becomes a problem for its neighbours, because those neighbours were relying on it too. Like a net stretched tightly across the sea. The Bronze Age world was strong because so many places were connected. But that also meant a tear in one part could pull at the whole thing. Still, systems collapse is a framework, not a complete answer. It tells us how trouble could spread. It does not tell us precisely what started the trouble in every city, every kingdom, and every year. Archaeology shows destruction, abandonment, disruption, and adaptation. It does not always reveal whether the first break came from famine, war, politics, earthquakes, failed trade, or all of them together. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of what makes this ancient disaster feel so unsettling. If you enjoy following mysteries where the evidence is real, but the final answer remains just out of reach, the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website, with the link in the description. For the people living through this period, though, there was no need for a theory. They knew only that the ships were late, the metal was scarce, the grain stores were shrinking, and the old promises of the palace, that it could organize the world, protect its people, and keep the supplies moving, were beginning to sound less like certainty and more like memory. Then nature added still more pressure to a system already straining at every joint. When the grain stores begin to shrink, people notice long before historians do. They notice the fields first. The barley is shorter than it should be. The wheat heads are thin. The soil is dry beneath the surface. A stream that usually runs through spring has become a chain of muddy pools. Shepherds drive their flocks farther from home in search of pasture. Farmers look at the sky, then at the palace officials arriving to collect taxes, and wonder how they are supposed to give away grain they do not have. For the people of the Late Bronze Age, weather was never just weather. Rain meant food, food meant labour, labour meant taxes, soldiers, trade, and political stability. A few bad harvests could be endured. Communities had stores, neighbours, kinship networks, and in some places, access to imported grain. But when dry years continued one after another, those safety nets began to fray. And there are reasons to think that parts of the eastern Mediterranean may have experienced serious climate stress around the time the Bronze Age world was breaking apart. Not everywhere in exactly the same way. Not necessarily in precisely 1177 BC, and not as a single giant drought descending over every kingdom at once. The evidence is more complicated than that. But across the region, scientists have found signs suggesting periods of reduced rainfall and changing environmental conditions during the late 2nd millennium BC. The clues come from places that do not look very dramatic at first. Mud at the bottom of lakes, dust trapped in caves, ancient pollen grains, isotopes in shells, a line in an Egyptian inscription, a desperate letter asking for grain. Individually, each clue is incomplete. Together, they suggest that the old Bronze Age system may have been facing a climate problem at exactly the moment it could least afford one. Start with pollen. Every plant releases pollen. Tiny grains so durable that they can survive for thousands of years in lake beds, marshes, and sediments. When scientists drill down through layers of mud, they are effectively moving backward through time. Recent pollen sits near the top. Older pollen lies farther below. By identifying the plants represented in each layer, researchers can reconstruct broad changes in the landscape. More pollen from trees may suggest wetter conditions depending on the region. More pollen from dry grasses, scrub, or plants that thrive in disturbed ground can point toward aridity, deforestation, overgrazing, or some combination of all three. And that last part matters. Pollen does not come with a little label saying, "Drought caused this." A decline in woodland pollen might mean rainfall fell, or it might mean people cut down trees for fuel, shipbuilding, smelting, and agriculture. A rise in weeds might reflect a dry climate or abandoned fields. Or both. Ancient landscapes were shaped by nature and by human activity at the same time. Still, in several areas around the eastern Mediterranean, pollen records suggest that the period around the end of the Bronze Age saw changing vegetation patterns consistent with drier conditions. Lake sediments offer another kind of evidence. A lake is like a slow, patient archive. Every year material washes into it. Soil from nearby slopes, pollen from surrounding plants, ash from fires, minerals carried by streams. In dry periods, water levels may fall, shorelines may retreat, and the chemical balance of the lake can change. In some cases, salts become more concentrated. In others, sediments indicate less runoff from rainfall. Researchers studying lakes and wetlands from Greece to Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, and beyond have found evidence that points toward environmental instability during this broad period. Some records suggest drought, others suggest a shift in seasonal rainfall. Some show local change that may have been severe for nearby farming communities, but not necessarily for the entire Mediterranean world. Because this is the thing about climate, it is regional. A drought in inland Syria is not automatically a drought in coastal Canaan. A failed harvest in Cyprus does not tell us exactly what happened in Egypt. Mountain valleys, river plains, islands and coastal cities can experience the same larger climate trend very differently. One community may receive just enough rain to survive. Another, 50 miles away, may lose its crop. Caves preserve another archive. As rainwater seeps through rock, it slowly builds stalagmites and other mineral formations. The chemistry of those layers can preserve information about ancient rainfall patterns. More moisture, less moisture, changes in temperature, shifts in the source of rain clouds, all can leave faint signals locked inside stone. These records are incredibly valuable, but they are not magic calendars. Dating ancient climate events can involve ranges of years or even decades. A stalagmite may show that a dry interval occurred around the time of the Bronze Age collapse. It may not be able to tell us whether a particular city burned before, during, or after the worst years of drought. And one cave reflects conditions in its own region, not the entire known world. Then there are the written texts. These are sometimes the most human pieces of evidence. Kings boasting that they fed hungry lands, officials requesting shipments, rulers worrying about shortages, letters moving between courts while the old diplomatic world was still functioning, but only barely. In the Hittite archives, there are references to grain shipments and food shortages. Egypt, with the Nile and its agricultural wealth, was in a position to send grain abroad in certain periods. One Egyptian text from the reign of Merneptah records grain being sent to relieve hunger among the Hittites. That does not prove one simple empire-wide drought, but it does show that food insecurity was real enough to become an international concern. Think about what that means. The great powers were not only exchanging gold, horses, princesses, bronze, and polite letters calling each other brother. They were also moving grain because someone somewhere did not have enough. And grain shortages are politically dangerous. A palace can survive a disappointing harvest if it has reserves. It can survive a local crisis if merchants can bring food from elsewhere. But if the countryside produces less grain for several years while trade routes are threatened, while enemies raid the borders, while workers expect rations, while elites demand their privileges, then every sack of barley becomes a political decision. Do you feed the army? Do you feed the capital? Do you feed the workers repairing the walls? Do you send grain to an ally and preserve a treaty? Or do you keep it at home and risk turning that ally into an enemy? This is where drought becomes more than an environmental event. It becomes an amplifier. It makes existing conflicts sharper. It makes inequality harder to tolerate. It encourages migration from damaged regions into areas that are already struggling. It makes raiding more tempting because hungry people do not always wait patiently for relief. It weakens trade because kingdoms facing shortages may stop exporting food. And once trade weakens, all the other fragile parts of the Bronze Age system begin to suffer again. But climate stress alone did not burn every palace. Drought cannot explain every destroyed wall, every abandoned settlement, every political assassination, every invasion, or every shipwreck. Some cities fell in battle, some may have been damaged by earthquakes. Some were abandoned gradually, some survived. Egypt bent, but did not break in the same way as the Hittite kingdom. Assyria endured and later expanded. There was no single Mediterranean weather report announcing the end of civilization. There were only difficult years, failed rains, bad harvests, rising prices, hungry villages, nervous rulers, grain ships sent across dangerous seas, and governments already burdened by war, debt, trade disruption, and the growing fear that the old order was slipping away. A drought does not have to destroy a civilization by itself. Sometimes it only has to arrive when everything else is already going wrong. And in the Bronze Age world, almost everything was already going wrong. And sometimes, when everything else is already going wrong, the ground itself begins to move. For decades, some archaeologists have wondered whether a series of major earthquakes helped push the Bronze Age world toward collapse. The eastern Mediterranean sits on a restless meeting place of tectonic plates. Greece, western Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, and parts of Egypt have all experienced earthquakes throughout recorded history. Ancient people did not need modern geology to understand the danger. They lived with shaking walls, cracked roads, fallen roofs, and cities built again on top of older cities that had already fallen. The theory is sometimes called an earthquake storm. Not one single earthquake destroying the entire region on one terrible afternoon. That would be much too simple. Instead, the idea is that a period of repeated seismic activity may have struck different places over several decades, perhaps from the late 13th century into the early 12th century BC. A palace damaged in one place, a port disrupted somewhere else. A fortified town weakened, then attacked before it could recover. In a world already facing food shortages, political tension, migration, raids, and collapsing trade routes, that kind of repeated damage could be devastating. But here is the problem. Earthquakes are very good at destroying buildings. They are not very good at leaving behind signed confession letters. When archaeologists uncover a ruined city, they are not usually greeted by a neat layer labelled Earthquake, 1180 BC. They find broken walls, burned beams, crushed pottery, fallen stones, ash, human bones sometimes, storage jars smashed on floors. Arrowheads, abandoned tools, later settlers digging pits through older ruins. Thousands of years of wind, rain, rebuilding, scavenging, and human confusion all mixed together. A destruction layer can look dramatic. It can feel like a solved mystery. You see a collapsed palace, blackened debris, and rooms suddenly sealed beneath rubble. It is tempting to imagine one clear event. Enemies came. The city burned. Everyone died. Sometimes that may be close to the truth. But ruins are rarely that cooperative. An earthquake can collapse a wall in a way that looks almost like an attack. Heavy stone blocks may fall outward, inward, or straight down, depending on the building, the slope, the force of the shaking, and which parts had already weakened with age. Mud brick walls can crumble into thick piles of debris. Roofs can collapse onto rooms, crushing jars and furniture exactly where they stood. Doors may jam. Fires may begin when lamps fall, hearths scatter embers, or damaged buildings are left exposed. And if an earthquake damages a city, enemies may arrive afterward. That is where the story gets complicated. Imagine a fortified town whose walls crack during a severe tremor. Its water system is damaged, grain stores spill, officials are killed beneath a fallen roof. Workers who should be repairing defences are busy digging relatives out of rubble. Then raiders hear that the city is weak. Was the city destroyed by an earthquake? Or by war? The honest answer may be both. Researchers look for physical clues. They study the direction in which walls fell. They examine whether large stones appear to have been pushed by a sudden sideways force or pulled apart by deliberate demolition. They look for foundations split along fault lines, floors warped by ground movement, and buildings that seem to have collapsed all at once. They also look for signs of fire. Burned beams can leave charcoal traces. Intense heat can redden mud brick, crack plaster, blacken floors, and turn stored grain into carbonized remains. If a destruction layer contains thick ash and widespread burning across a palace or town, fire clearly played a role. But fire does not automatically mean invasion. A damaged city can burn accidentally. A palace full of wood, textiles, oil, grain and timber roofs is basically an enormous collection of fuel. Once flames begin, especially during disorder, they can spread fast, and a fire, after an earthquake, may leave a clearer archaeological signature than the earthquake itself. War leaves its own possible clues, arrowheads lodged near gates, weapons scattered in streets, skeletons with wounds, evidence that valuables were removed or hidden, breached walls, a sudden end to imported goods or official records. Even these clues need caution. Arrowheads can come from defenders as well as attackers. Bodies may belong to victims of collapse, not battle. Valuable objects may be missing because survivors carried them away before abandoning the city. Walls can be broken by earthquakes, erosion, later construction, or people searching for reusable stone. This is why the phrase destruction layer can be misleading. It sounds like one thing happened. In reality, a layer may preserve a sequence. First shaking, then collapse, then fire, then looting, then abandonment, then rain washing soil over the ruins. Then, a generation later, families returning to salvage stone and metal from what remained. Archaeology can often tell us that a building ended violently. It is much harder to tell us exactly why, exactly when, and exactly who was responsible. Some sites in the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean have been suggested as possible earthquake victims. Certain collapsed structures in Greece, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant have patterns that may fit seismic damage. But the evidence varies from place to place. In some cities, warfare seems more plausible. In others, fire dominates the story. In still others, there is simply not enough surviving evidence to decide. And that uncertainty is not failure. It is the real shape of the past. The earthquake storm theory remains possible. Repeated earthquakes could absolutely have made local crises worse. They could have damaged ports, roads, palaces, walls, storehouses, and water systems. They could have disrupted already fragile administrations and created openings for rebellion or attack. But earthquakes do not explain the whole transformation. They do not explain every famine letter, every broken trade route, every migrating population, every political collapse, or every kingdom that survived. The ground may have shaken beneath the Bronze Age world, but that world was already unstable long before the stones began to fall. And above the ruins, amid the ash and broken walls, another danger was growing, not from the earth below, from the people who had been asked to endure too much for too long. From the people who had been asked to endure too much for too long. Because the Bronze Age palace was not just a beautiful building where a king lived. It was an economic machine at places like Mycenaean, Pylos, Knossos, Hattusa, Ugarit, and dozens of smaller centres, palace officials tracked grain, sheep oil, wine, textiles, metal, land, labourers, soldiers, priests, and craft specialists. They recorded deliveries, they counted rations, they assigned workers, they collected goods from surrounding villages and redistributed at least some of them back out again. The system could be remarkably effective. A farmer produces grain, a shepherd delivers wool. Women in textile workshops turn that wool into cloth. Bronze smiths receive copper and tin. Ship crews carry finished goods across the sea. Officials write it all down on clay tablets. The palace stores the surplus, supports the army, feeds workers, rewards allies, supplies temples, and keeps the whole complicated machine moving. When everything is working, centralization looks like strength. The palace can organize labour on a scale that small villages cannot. It can build roads, fortifications, harbours, storehouses, and warships. It can gather food for bad years. It can equip soldiers. It can connect distant regions through trade and diplomacy. But centralization has another side. When one place controls the grain, the weapons, the records, the religious ceremonies, and the flow of prestige goods, one place also becomes the target of anger. The surviving tablets give us glimpses of this tightly managed world. Linear B records from Mycenaean Greece, list workers and allocations with almost eerie precision. We see textile workers, shepherds, bronze workers, rowers, landholders, religious officials, and people identified by their home communities or occupations. Some received rations of grain, figs, wine, or other necessities. Others owed goods or labour to the palace. These documents are not written by ordinary people explaining how they felt. They are administrative records produced by people near the centre of power. They tell us what officials wanted counted, and what officials count is often what they fear losing: grain, wool, labour, weapons, loyalty. In the Hittite world, royal authority depended on governors, military commanders, vassal rulers, temple officials, and noble families, all of whom had their own interests. The king of Hatti could issue orders from Hattusa, but orders still had to travel across mountains, reach local authorities, and be obeyed by people whose lives might be getting harder every year. At Ugarit, the palace and merchant elite benefited from international trade. Imported copper, luxury goods, timber, dyed textiles, and grain moved through the city. But a rich port is not necessarily an equal one. The people loading ships, farming the countryside, rowing vessels, weaving cloth, or paying taxes may not have experienced that prosperity in the same way as the people sending diplomatic letters to foreign kings. And then the droughts deepen. Harvests fail. Grain shipments become emergency aid instead of ordinary trade. Taxes that were manageable in a good year become unbearable in a bad one. This is where inequality becomes dangerous. Imagine you're a farmer in a village tied to a palace. The harvest is poor. Your family needs grain. The palace needs grain too, because it must feed officials, guards, craft workers, religious staff, and perhaps refugees arriving from elsewhere. It must maintain the army. It must repay obligations to allies. It may have to send food abroad to preserve a political relationship. So an official arrives and demands your share. Maybe the palace lowers its demands. Maybe it opens its storehouses and saves lives. That is exactly what centralized storage can do. Or maybe the storehouses are already depleted. Maybe the local governor is corrupt. Maybe the best supplies go first to the palace, the temple, the army, and the elite. Maybe people begin to feel that the system takes from them in good years and abandons them in bad ones. We do not have a Bronze Age document that says the people rose up because inequality had become intolerable. History almost never gives us evidence that neat. But we do know that these societies contained sharp differences in status and access to resources. We know they demanded labour. We know they depended on taxes, tribute, and controlled redistribution. We know royal success depended on the confidence of local elites, military officers, village leaders, and workers whose names rarely survive. And confidence can disappear fast. A ruler who cannot provide food looks weak. A king who loses a battle looks weak. A palace damaged by earthquake, fire, or raid looks weak. A succession dispute can make everything worse, especially when rival princes, noble families, provincial governors, or foreign-backed claimants all believe the moment has come to seize power. The Hittite Empire had experienced succession conflicts before the final crisis. Mycenaean kingdoms may also have faced internal rivalries, though the evidence is frustratingly thin. Across the eastern Mediterranean, local unrest, disputed authority, desertion, and rebellion are all possible pieces of the larger puzzle. Possible is the important word. Some burned palaces may have been attacked by outsiders. Some may have been destroyed after internal conflict. Some may have fallen because disaster and famine made normal government impossible. And some may have been abandoned by people who simply concluded that the old centre could no longer protect them. A palace state is strongest when it can turn surplus into security. But when surplus vanishes, the palace still has obligations. Soldiers still need food. Fortifications still need repair. Messengers still need to travel. Officials still expect payment. Allies still demand help. The system does not become simpler just because resources become scarce. It becomes more desperate, and desperation creates choices that can destroy trust. Raise taxes, seize grain, draft more workers, cut rations, favour the army over the countryside, favour the capital over distant villages, punish resistance, promise help that never arrives. Each choice may make sense to someone inside the palace. Each one may also push another group away. So when invasion came, or when migrants appeared at the borders, or when rivals tested a kingdom already weakened by hunger and political suspicion, these states may have discovered that their greatest strength had become a trap. They had built magnificent systems capable of controlling thousands of lives. But those systems depended on thousands of people continuing to believe they were worth supporting. And beyond the palace walls, powerful enemies were watching. And beyond the palace walls, powerful enemies were watching. Not always enemies in the simple sense. Not always strangers gathering in the darkness, waiting for civilization to become weak. For centuries, the great kingdoms of the late Bronze Age had lived in a world of warfare, diplomacy, tribute, marriage alliances, hostage exchanges, border disputes, and carefully worded threats. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the kingdoms of Mycenaean Greece, Assyria, Babylonia, and the smaller states of the Levant were connected by trade. But trade did not make them peaceful. It gave them more to fight over. Land meant grain. Forests meant timber for ships and palaces. Mountains meant metals. Ports meant customs duties, merchant ships, and access to distant allies. A small kingdom sitting beside an important road or harbour could become rich. It could also become the place where two larger powers decided to test each other. The Hittites and Egyptians had spent generations competing for influence in Syria and Canaan. These were not empty lands between empires. They were home to kingdoms such as Ugarit, Amurru, Kadesh, Carchemish, Byblos, and many others. Their rulers made alliances, changed sides, paid tribute, sent gifts, and tried to survive between larger neighbours. Sometimes they succeeded brilliantly. Sometimes they were crushed. The most famous clash came around 1274 BC at the Battle of Kadesh. Ramesses II of Egypt and Muwatalli II of Hatti brought enormous armies into conflict over control of Syria. Egyptian inscriptions present Ramesses as a heroic warrior standing almost alone against impossible odds. Hittite sources tell a less theatrical story. The battle was probably not the total victory either king claimed, but it revealed something important. These states could mobilize thousands of men, horses, chariots, weapons, food animals, wagons, scribes, messengers, and support workers across vast distances. A Bronze Age army was not just soldiers carrying spears. It was a moving demand for grain, water, fodder, leather, timber, bronze, and labour. And all of it had to be supplied. A chariot force needed horses fed every day. Garrisons needed rations, fortresses needed repairs. Roads needed to remain open. Local communities near a marching army might be ordered to provide grain, animals, carts, and workers. War could bring prestige to a king. It could also empty his storehouses. The peace treaty that followed Kadesh is often described as one of the earliest surviving international treaties. Egypt and Hatti agreed to peace, mutual aid, and the return of fugitives. Royal marriages helped seal the relationship. On the surface, it looks like stability. And for a time it was, but peace between two great powers did not mean the pressure disappeared. It meant the pressure moved elsewhere. Both empires still had to manage restless vassals, ambitious officials, rival claimants, raiders, and border communities whose loyalty could never be assumed. Then there was Assyria. Far to the east, in Mesopotamia, Assyria had been growing stronger. Earlier in the Bronze Age, it had often stood in the shadow of other major powers. But by the 13th century BC, Assyrian kings were expanding their military reach, taking cities, demanding tribute, and challenging the old balance of power. For the Hittites, this was deeply worrying. The Hittite Empire faced threats along several frontiers at once. In the west were the Arzawa lands and other Anatolian peoples. In the north were the Kaska, communities beyond the Hittite heartland, who repeatedly raided, settled, withdrew, and returned. In Syria, Hittite vassals had to be watched. In the east, Assyria was becoming more aggressive. No empire enjoys a quiet border forever, and the people beyond those borders were not simply chaos waiting to happen. The old texts often describe them from the viewpoint of kings and palace scribes. They call them troublesome, rebellious, foreign, or dangerous. But those labels can hide real human societies with their own leaders, grievances, trading connections, and reasons for moving. Some may have been escaping drought. Some may have been pushed by war. Some may have seen an empire weakening and recognized an opportunity. Some may have been recruited as mercenaries. Some may have been rebels who had once served the very states they later attacked. A border is not a line on a map. It is a zone where languages, goods, armies, families, and rumours move back and forth. That matters because the final decades before 1177 BC were not a single peaceful world suddenly interrupted by catastrophe. They were already marked by strain. The Hittite kings worried about food. Egyptian rulers defended their approaches. Levantine cities watched the sea. Mycenaean centres appear to have strengthened some defences and organised coastal vigilance. Assyria pressed outward, while other powers struggled to hold together what they already had. Every military response cost something. Send troops to one frontier, and another frontier becomes weaker. Use grain to feed an army, and there is less for hungry civilians. Build fortifications, and labourers are taken away from fields. Demand tribute from a vassal in a bad year, and that vassal may decide another overlord looks more attractive. Or no overlord at all. This is how long pressure prepares the ground for sudden collapse. Not because one battle automatically destroys a civilization. Not because a single invasion explains every burned city. But because decades of war can turn a complicated system brittle. The treasury is thinner. The army is tired. The roads are unsafe. The villages are poorer, the governors are less loyal. The merchants take fewer risks. The refugees at the border become another problem to feed, control, recruit, or fear. Then one more harvest fails. One more rival attacks. One more province refuses to obey, and a kingdom that once looked permanent discovers that it has been fighting to remain standing for much longer than anyone realized. But here is the part of the story that gets lost when people say that in 1177 BC, every civilization on Earth collapsed at once. They didn't, not even close. The late Bronze Age world was devastated in some regions. Major palaces burned, trade routes broke apart. Kingdoms that had dominated entire landscapes disappeared from the written record. The Hittite Empire vanished as a unified political power. Mycenaean palace society in Greece collapsed. Ugarit was destroyed. Many cities along the eastern Mediterranean suffered abandonment, attack, or long decline. But other states endured. Some were weakened, some lost territory. Some changed dynasties. Some went through years of war, famine, and political chaos. Yet they remained recognizable societies, with farmers planting crops, merchants moving goods, scribes writing documents, temples receiving offerings, and kings claiming authority. The Bronze Age collapse was not a switch that turned civilization off. It was more like a storm system moving across an interconnected world. Some places were hit directly. Some were battered, but remained standing. Some were far enough inland, organized differently enough, or lucky enough in timing to survive the worst of it. Assyria is one of the clearest examples. In the centuries before 1177 BC, Assyria had become a serious military power in northern Mesopotamia. Its kings had expanded westward, fought rivals, seized cities, and pushed into territories claimed by the Hittites and Babylonians. Assyria was not an invincible superpower. It had enemies, restless provinces, difficult frontiers, and its own succession problems. But when the Hittite state collapsed, Assyria did not vanish with it. It endured. The Assyrian heartland was centered on the Tigris River, around cities like Ashur, Nineveh, and Arbela. This was not an isolated refuge. Assyria was deeply involved in the wider Near Eastern world. It needed trade, tribute, military labour, and access to resources beyond its core territory. Disruptions to long-distance exchange would have hurt it. Warfare and population movement along its borders created real danger. Still, its political centre held. Assyrian kings continued to rule. Administrators continued to collect taxes and organise labour. Temples and cities remained important institutions. The state contracted at times, especially during the unsettled centuries after 1200 BC. Some outlying territories were lost, the records become thinner. The old confidence of imperial expansion was harder to maintain. But a difficult period is not the same thing as extinction. Over the next few centuries, Assyria recovered its strength. Then it expanded with a force that would eventually reshape the entire Near East. By the early first millennium BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire would become one of history's most formidable imperial systems, ruling from Mesopotamia across Syria and the Levant into Anatolia, Egypt, and Iran. The people living through 1177 BC could not have known that. They may have looked at broken trade routes, abandoned cities, hungry migrants, and unstable borders and assumed the old world was ending. In a sense, it was. But Assyria shows that endings can also be beginnings. The collapse of older rivals created openings. Vacant territories, weakened neighbours, and disrupted political systems could become opportunities for a state that retained enough soldiers, grain, bureaucracy, and internal cohesion to act. Babylonia tells a different story. South of Assyria in the fertile plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, The Kassite dynasty had ruled Babylon for centuries. Kassite Babylonia was part of the International Bronze Age order. Its kings exchanged letters and gifts with Egypt, married into foreign royal families, and participated in the diplomatic world of great powers. But Babylonia was also vulnerable. Its agriculture depended on managing rivers, canals, and irrigation networks. Its cities depended on stable political authority. And it lay close to Elam, a powerful kingdom to the east, in what is now southwestern Iran. Around the middle of the 12th century BC, Elamite armies invaded Babylonia. They defeated the Kassite rulers, carried off treasures, and, according to later tradition, took the famous statue of Marduk from Babylon itself. For the Kassite dynasty this was a catastrophe, but Babylon did not disappear. The dynasty ended. The political order changed, yet the cities remained. Temples continued to function. Scribes continued the ancient Mesopotamian traditions of writing, law, astronomy, ritual, and literature. New rulers emerged. Old institutions adapted. This is one of the most important lessons of the period. A kingdom can fall without its people vanishing. A palace can burn without every village around it becoming empty. A royal dynasty can end while the language, religion, farming systems, and urban life of a region continue. And then there was Elam. Elam is often treated as a side character in Bronze Age histories, mentioned mainly when its armies appear in Mesopotamia. But Elam was a major civilization in its own right, with deep roots, powerful kings, important cities, and a cultural tradition stretching back centuries. During the crisis years, Elam was not simply surviving. At moments it was expanding. Elamite kings took advantage of Babylonian weakness. They campaigned westward, won victories, and brought home prestige and plunder. Yet Elam, too, faced instability. Its fortunes rose and fell. No state escaped the wider pressures entirely, but it remained politically active long after the Hittite capital had fallen silent, and the archives of Ugarit had been buried beneath ash and rubble. Egypt also survived, though not unchanged. Ramesses III defeated attacks on Egypt's borders, but victory did not restore the old Bronze Age system. Egypt gradually lost influence in Canaan and Syria. Its imperial reach narrowed. Internal tensions grew. Royal authority became less secure. In later generations, Egypt entered the long and complicated period historians call the Third Intermediate Period. This was not the Egypt of earlier centuries, but it was still Egypt. The Nile still flooded. Farmers still planted grain along its banks. Priests still served in temples. Scribes still wrote in the names of kings. Monumental culture continued. The state bent, fractured, and changed, but it did not simply disappear into the darkness. And beyond the famous capitals, countless inland communities continued living through the transition in ways archaeology only partly reveals. Small towns could be more flexible than palace centres. Villages did not require fleets of merchant ships, imported copper, royal workshops, chariot forces, or distant vassals sending tribute on schedule. A farming community with local water, nearby pasture, defensible land, and strong kinship ties might suffer terribly during a regional crisis. But it might also survive where a palace economy could not. That is the strange weakness of complexity. The larger and more connected a system becomes, the more it can achieve. It can build cities, field armies, move goods across seas, and support specialists who never touch a plough. But it also depends on more things continuing to work. Roads, ports, harvests, tax collectors, storehouses, loyal governors, merchant confidence, access to metals, order at the borders. If enough of those fail at once, the system can become too expensive to maintain. Meanwhile, a smaller community may simply plant what it can, trade locally, move uphill, build a wall, take in relatives, and keep going. So why did some societies prove more resilient than others? Geography mattered. Inland river valleys were not immune to war, but they were less dependent on vulnerable sea routes. Access to fertile land, reliable water, timber, metals, or defensible terrain could make survival easier. Institutions mattered too. States with durable temples, experienced scribes, tax systems, and administrative centres had ways to organise recovery. They could redistribute grain, mobilise labour, repair canals, negotiate with local leaders, and preserve knowledge from one generation to the next. Timing mattered. A kingdom struck by drought, invasion, rebellion, and trade disruption, all within a few years, might break. Another kingdom facing only one or two of those pressures could endure long enough for conditions to improve. And luck mattered. History is full of systems that look strong until the wrong crisis arrives at the wrong moment. So 1177 BC should not be imagined as the day every civilization on Earth fell dead together. It was not even the day every Near Eastern state collapsed. It was a regional transformation, uneven and brutal. Some great powers disappeared, some were reduced, some adapted. Some found new strength in the ruins of the old order. And while the palaces of the Bronze Age burned in some places, the people who survived were already beginning to build a different world. That different world did not appear overnight. There was no morning when everyone woke up, looked at the ruins of the old palaces, and decided that the Bronze Age was over. For generations, people continued using Bronze Age habits, Bronze Age tools, Bronze Age roads, and Bronze Age memories. Farmers still planted barley and wheat. Shepherds still moved flocks between pasture lands. Potters still shaped clay vessels. Families still gathered around hearths and buried their dead according to customs older than any palace. But the centres of power had changed. In many regions, the great fortified capitals were gone, weakened, or no longer able to control the countryside. The old system had concentrated wealth, labour, records, and decision-making in a relatively small number of palace centres. When those centres failed, people did not necessarily vanish. Often they moved. Some went to smaller towns. Some returned to villages closer to their fields. Some settled on hills, ridges, and defensible slopes. Some joined communities formed by refugees, soldiers, former labourers, traders, and families displaced by war or hunger. Archaeologists can see this pattern in many parts of the eastern Mediterranean. Large palace sites decline or are abandoned. At the same time, smaller settlements begin appearing in places that had been lightly occupied before. The population becomes harder to track because it is no longer gathered in a few monumental cities with archives and official buildings. History gets quieter, not because nobody was living there, because fewer people were writing on clay tablets inside palaces. Imagine the difference. A palace state leaves behind storerooms, tax records, diplomatic letters, workshop inventories, and lists of workers. A small farming village might leave stone foundations, cooking pots, animal bones, storage jars, and little else. One looks like history, the other can look like emptiness, unless you know where and how to look. And this is why the period after 1200 BC was once called a Dark Age. The name sounds dramatic. It suggests a world covered in ashes, empty fields, and forgotten knowledge. But the darkness was partly ours. It came from the loss of written records in some regions, especially Greece, where the linear B writing system of the Mycenaean palaces disappeared along with the institutions that had used it. For centuries after the palace collapse, Greek-speaking communities continued to live, farm, build, trade, fight, marry, tell stories, and remember their ancestors. But they were no longer keeping palace accounts in Linear B. Without the tablets, we know far less about their kings, their laws, their harvests, and their daily decisions. That does not mean nothing happened. It means the surviving evidence changed. In Greece, the old palace kingdoms gave way to regional societies. Some communities remained near former centres like Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns. Others shifted towards smaller settlements. Political authority became more local, probably centred on household leaders, warrior elites, village assemblies, and small chiefs rather than a single palace bureaucracy ruling a wide territory. The scale had shrunk, but smaller did not mean simple or powerless. These communities adapted to a world with less international trade and more uncertainty. They built relationships with neighbours. They guarded local resources. They maintained seafaring skills, and over the following centuries they would lay the foundations for the city-states of archaic and classical Greece. Farther east, other new societies were taking shape along the Levantine coast. The cities we call Phoenician, including Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, and later Beirut, had existed long before the collapse. They were not suddenly invented in the ruins, but the weakening of larger empires created new opportunities for coastal cities that could organize trade, build ships, and negotiate with whoever controlled the surrounding land. They had harbours. They had timber from the Lebanon mountains. They had skilled craftspeople, merchants, sailors, and access to the sea. And in a fragmented world, those things mattered. Phoenician cities did not unite into one large empire. They remained separate city-states, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. Yet their merchants would eventually connect the Mediterranean in new ways, carrying timber, purple dye, metal goods, glass, luxury objects, and perhaps most influential of all, alphabetic writing. The alphabet was not created from nothing after the collapse. Earlier alphabetic experiments existed in the Bronze Age, but simplified writing systems became increasingly useful in a world where literacy no longer belonged only to palace-trained scribes working with hundreds of complicated signs. A small set of letters could travel. It could be learned by merchants, officials, craftsmen, and sailors. It did not require a royal archive full of clay tablets to survive. Meanwhile, in the southern Levant, communities later identified in Egyptian texts as Philistines established themselves in several coastal cities, including Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, and Gaza. Their origins remain debated. Archaeology suggests that early Philistine culture included connections to the Aegean world, visible in pottery styles, food practices, and some architectural traditions. But they were not simply foreign invaders frozen in time. Within generations, Philistine communities were deeply entangled with the local Levantine world. They adopted local materials, exchanged goods with neighbours, spoke languages of the region, and became part of its political landscape. Their cities were not temporary camps left by raiders. They were settled, productive, complex communities. Inland, Aramaean groups were also becoming more visible. Aramaic-speaking populations had long existed in parts of Syria and Mesopotamia. But after the old imperial order weakened, a number of Aramaean states emerged across inland Syria. Small kingdoms formed around towns, river valleys, caravan routes, and defensible territories. Places like Damascus, Hamath, Bitadini, and others would become important players in the first millennium BC. Again, this was not one unified Aramaean empire. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, tribal confederations, towns, and local rulers. But their language would eventually spread astonishingly far, becoming one of the great languages of the ancient Near East. And then there was iron. It is tempting to tell this part of the story as if bronze failed, iron appeared, and humanity instantly upgraded. That is not what happened. Iron had been known for centuries before the collapse. Small iron objects existed in the Bronze Age, sometimes made from meteorite iron, sometimes from smelted ore. But iron was difficult to produce consistently. It required high temperatures, careful control of furnaces, skilled smiths, and repeated heating and hammering to make useful tools or weapons. Bronze was still excellent material. It was easier to cast into complex shapes. It could be hard, reliable, and familiar. The problem was not that bronze suddenly became bad. The problem was that bronze depended on copper and tin, often brought from distant places through trade networks that had become unstable. Iron ore, by contrast, was more widely available in many regions. Not everywhere, not equally, and not immediately in useful quantities. But over time, as smiths learned better techniques, and as long-distance bronze supply chains remained unreliable, iron became increasingly practical. The Iron Age was not born in a single battle or a single invention. It arrived gradually, workshop by workshop, village by village, kingdom by kingdom. And that gradual change tells us something important. The people after the collapse were not merely scavenging through the ruins of a lost golden age. They were experimenting. They were adapting materials, rebuilding trade, forming new alliances, and creating political systems better suited to a fragmented world. Some old knowledge was lost, some was preserved in temples and cities that endured. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, scribal traditions continued. Priests and administrators still copied texts, recorded offerings, managed land, and preserved languages written in ancient scripts. In Greece, literacy disappeared for a time, then returned centuries later in a new alphabetic form. So this was not the end of civilization. It was civilization changing shape. The palaces had promised order through central control, long-distance trade and royal power. The world that followed was more local, more divided, and in many ways more dangerous. But it was also flexible. Out of burned capitals, broken routes, and scattered villages came seafaring cities, new languages of power, new metals, new kingdoms, and new ways of recording human memory. The old world had fallen apart. The next one was already learning how to live without it. And that is where archaeology becomes both powerful and humbling, because no one left us a single document saying, "Here is why the Bronze Age world collapsed." There is no master report from 1177 BC. No surviving king, merchant, soldier, farmer, or refugee who sat down and explained the entire disaster from beginning to end. Instead, archaeologists reconstruct this lost world from fragments. A burned doorway, a broken storage jar, a tablet dropped on a floor, a human skeleton in a ruined house, seeds preserved in ash, a shipwreck at the bottom of the sea. Each piece is small, but put enough pieces together from enough places and patterns begin to emerge. Imagine excavating an ancient city, one thin layer at a time. Near the surface are the remains of later houses, roads, walls, and graves. Deeper down are older neighbourhoods. Then perhaps a layer of rubble, blackened timber, collapsed mud brick, smashed pottery and burned grain. That layer tells you something important. A major destruction happened here. But it does not immediately tell you why. A city can burn because of an invading army. It can burn during an internal rebellion. It can burn by accident. Earthquakes can knock over lamps, scatter fires through wooden buildings, and leave destruction that looks remarkably violent. Abandonment can happen slowly, with people carrying away useful objects long before the final roof falls in. Even ash can be complicated. A burned palace may suggest attack. But if the site also contains weapons, unburied bodies, broken defences and signs of hurried departure, the case for violence becomes stronger. If there are earthquake fractures beneath the collapse, or repeated rebuilding after earlier tremors, another explanation becomes possible. Archaeology works by weighing clues, not by finding one magical object that answers every question. Pottery is one of the most useful clues. It sounds almost too ordinary. Pots break. People throw them away. They end up in almost every settlement. But pottery styles change over time, and different regions develop recognizable shapes, decorations, clays, and manufacturing methods. A certain kind of Mycenaean cup found in Cyprus, or a Cypriot vessel found in the Levant, can reveal trade connections between places separated by hundreds of miles. When those imported goods suddenly become rare, archaeologists notice. It may mean trade routes were disrupted. It may mean the people who made the goods were no longer producing them. Or it may mean local consumers changed their tastes. Again, the evidence opens possibilities. It does not always close the case. Clay tablets can be even more dramatic. At Ugarit, the final letters from the city give us something close to eyewitness testimony. Officials wrote about enemy ships, missing forces, urgent needs, and danger at the coast. Those words are direct evidence that people in the city felt threatened. But even letters have limits. They show what their writers knew, feared, or wanted others to believe at one particular moment. They do not explain every event that followed. A desperate message is not the same thing as a complete history. Then there are skeletons, animal bones, grains, pollen, and tiny chemical traces trapped in lake beds or cave deposits. These can reveal diets, disease, migration, rainfall, drought, crop failures, and changing landscapes. A reduction in tree pollen may suggest drier conditions. Isotopes in teeth can sometimes show that a person grew up somewhere different from where they were buried. Charred grain in a storeroom can show what a palace was trying to preserve when disaster arrived. The ancient world speaks in many languages: stone, clay, bone, metal, seeds, ash, even mud. The difficult part is connecting them across time and space. Suppose one city in Greece burns around 1200 BC. Another site in Anatolia is abandoned sometime near that period. A Levantine port is destroyed within a few decades. Egypt records attacks by foreign groups. Is this one enormous event moving across the Mediterranean? Or several different crises happening at different times, feeding into one another? The honest answer is that it may be both. Dates from this period are rarely precise enough to identify a single shared month, season, or year. Radiocarbon dating usually gives ranges, not a neat stamp that says Tuesday, October 1177 BC. Ceramic dating can narrow the timeline, but styles overlap. Written chronologies help in some kingdoms and disappear entirely in others. So when historians say the collapse around 1200 BC, they are describing a broad era of disruption, not necessarily one synchronized catastrophe. New discoveries can change that picture. For a long time, a burned layer might be explained mainly as invasion. Then climate records reveal a severe drought at roughly the same time. Or new tablets show food shortages and political strain before the attack. Or a harbour excavation uncovers evidence that trade continued longer than anyone expected. A theory that once seemed certain becomes one possibility among several. That is not archaeology failing. That is archaeology correcting itself. The strongest histories separate different kinds of claims. Direct testimony is what a tablet actually says, what a skeleton actually shows, what a destruction layer actually contains. Reasonable inference is what those clues probably mean when they are compared carefully. Popular speculation is the story we might like to tell when the evidence becomes thin. Those three things are not equal, and perhaps that is the quiet lesson of 1177 BC. We can know a great deal without knowing everything. We can see palaces burn, trade routes fracture, populations move, harvests fail, and kingdoms weaken. We can trace the outlines of a world under pressure. But the final certainty remains buried, not because the past is empty, but because it was lived by millions of people whose ordinary voices were never written down. Archaeology does not erase that silence. It listens to it, patiently, fragment by fragment. And when we step back from all those fragments, from the ash layers and abandoned ports and anxious letters pressed into clay, a larger pattern begins to emerge. The Bronze Age world was powerful because it was connected, and it may have been fragile for exactly the same reason. Think about what it took to keep a great palace running. A king in Mycenaean Greece needed bronze weapons, bronze tools, fine pottery, timber, textiles, grain, livestock, ships, scribes, labourers, guards, tax collectors, and messengers. But bronze itself was not something Greece could simply make from the ground beneath its feet. Copper might come from Cyprus. Tin could arrive from far away, perhaps Anatolia, Central Asia, or other routes still debated by scholars. Ivory came from Africa or the Near East. Luxury goods moved by ship between Egypt, the Levant, Cyprus, Anatolia, Crete, and the Aegean. Every palace was like the centre of a web, and every strand had to hold. As long as harvests were good, ships kept sailing, roads remained safe, and rulers could collect taxes, this web created astonishing wealth. Palaces stored grain. Craftsmen made weapons and furniture. Scribes counted sheep, jars of oil, and shipments of metal. Rulers exchanged gifts across hundreds of miles and called one another brother. But now imagine several problems arriving close together. A few bad harvests mean less grain. Less grain means hungry families, rising prices, unpaid workers, and soldiers who are harder to feed. A drought in one region might not destroy a kingdom by itself, but if that kingdom depends on imported food, and the merchants carrying it are threatened by war or piracy, the shortage becomes worse. Then people begin moving. Farmers leave dry land, villages empty. Families travel toward coasts, river valleys, fortified towns, or richer kingdoms. Some arrive peacefully, hoping for work or protection. Others may come armed. Some may already be soldiers without pay, sailors without ports, or communities driven from homes that no longer support them. The rulers receiving them face impossible choices. Do they open the gates and share dwindling grain? Do they turn strangers away? Do they recruit them into armies? Do they send their own troops to defend borders, even while unrest grows at home? And all of this can happen while the palace system itself is becoming weaker. A king who cannot distribute food loses authority. Officials may hoard supplies. Local governors may stop obeying orders. Rival claimants may see a chance to seize power. A garrison sent to fight enemies abroad cannot guard a road, protect a harvest, or keep order in a hungry city. A rebellion, an invasion, an earthquake, or a fire that might once have been manageable can suddenly become catastrophic. This is what historians mean when they talk about cascading failure. Not one dramatic cause, not one invading army sweeping across the entire eastern Mediterranean like a storm cloud. Not one earthquake, not one drought, not one group called the Sea Peoples. Instead, one pressure makes another pressure harder to survive. Drought weakens harvests. Hunger fuels migration. Migration increases conflict. Conflict disrupts trade. Disrupted trade leaves palaces without bronze, food, timber, or income. Political weakness makes defence more difficult. Destruction interrupts farming and shipping even further. Then the system begins to break, not at one point, but everywhere at once. It is like a row of lamps in a dark hallway. One lamp going out is inconvenient. But if the oil supply fails, the servants flee, the doors are blocked, and the wind blows through broken windows. Soon the whole hallway is dark. That is why the single cause explanation can feel unsatisfying. It asks too much of one event. The evidence suggests a world already under strain, where different regions suffered different combinations of disasters. Ugarit may have faced attack from the sea. The Hittite state may have been weakened by food shortages, internal divisions, and pressure along its borders. Mycenaean palaces may have collapsed through a mixture of violence, instability, and economic breakdown. Egypt survived, but at a great cost, and not without its own periods of hunger, labour unrest, and political decline. The collapse was not identical everywhere, but the connections between these societies meant that trouble could travel, and behind every fallen palace were ordinary people. A farmer watching the rains fail, then trying to decide whether to plant again. A sailor waiting in a harbour for cargo that never arrives. A scribe recording smaller grain rations in a storeroom. A soldier ordered to march toward a frontier he has never seen. A mother packing what she can carry. A family hearing that the road is unsafe, the city gates are closed, the king's army has been defeated. For them, this was not the late Bronze Age collapse. It was the end of the world they knew. Some died in burned cities, some fled, some adapted, moving into smaller settlements, learning new trades, using iron where bronze had once defined power. Some children grew up never knowing that their parents had lived under kings whose names were recognized across the sea. And still, the central mystery remains. We can see the pressures. We can trace the broken networks. We can identify drought, war, migration, political weakness, and trade disruption as parts of the story. But we cannot yet say exactly how they combined, in every kingdom, in every year, for every person. Perhaps that uncertainty is part of the warning. Complex societies do not always collapse because of one great blow. Sometimes they become so efficient, so interconnected, so dependent on distant people and distant resources, that a series of smaller shocks can do what no single enemy ever could. So what really happened in 1177 BC? The honest answer is both less dramatic and more unsettling than the legend. Not every civilization on Earth collapsed at once. The date itself is a marker, not a single morning when every palace from Greece to Egypt burst into flames. Some cities fell earlier, others lasted longer. Some kingdoms were destroyed. Some were wounded but survived. And in many places, ordinary village life continued, even while the great centres of power disappeared. But something enormous did happen across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, around the end of the 13th and beginning of the 12th century BC. A world held together by ships, palaces, tribute, bronze, grain, diplomacy, and royal power began coming apart. In Mycenaean Greece, the palace centres burned or were abandoned. The scribes stopped writing linear B tablets. The storerooms, workshops, administrative halls, and fortified citadels that had organised life for generations no longer worked as they once had. Greece did not become empty. People remained. But the palace world with its kings, bureaucrats, and far-reaching trade connections was gone. In central Anatolia, the Hittite Empire vanished with astonishing speed. Hattusa, its great capital, was abandoned and later burned. The empire that had negotiated as an equal with Egypt, that had fielded armies and controlled vast territories, ceased to exist as a unified state. We do not have one final message telling us exactly why. Instead, we have hints of grain shortages, enemies at the borders, internal stress, disrupted trade, and a government that may simply have lost the ability to hold its world together. At Ugarit, the final letters are perhaps the most haunting evidence of all. Officials asked for help, ships were away, enemies were near. The danger was real enough to be written into clay. Then the city was destroyed, its archives buried, its harbour silenced. Those tablets survived because the people who wrote them never returned to collect them. Cyprus, so important for its copper, also saw destruction and disruption at settlements across the island. In the Levant, cities were destroyed, rebuilt, abandoned, or transformed. Some communities endured by changing, others vanished from the record. Along the sea routes that had once carried metal, timber, oil, pottery, and royal gifts, movement became dangerous and uncertain. Egypt did not fall in the same way. Ramesses III claimed victories over attacking forces we call the Sea Peoples. His inscriptions show battles on land and water, and they present Egypt as the kingdom that stood firm while others were overwhelmed. But even Egypt was under immense strain, feeding armies, defending borders, managing shortages, and maintaining royal authority came at a cost. Later records reveal labour unrest, economic difficulty, and political instability. Egypt survived the storm, but it emerged weaker, and that may be the best way to understand the whole event. There was no single proven cause. The Sea Peoples were real enough in Egyptian records, but they may not have been one united nation. They could have included raiders, displaced families, mercenaries, migrants, and armies moving through a world already under pressure. Drought likely harmed harvests in parts of the region. Famine may have followed. Earthquakes struck some cities, though not all. Wars continued between great powers. Local rebellions may have weakened palace authority. Trade routes failed. The bronze supply chain broke down. Refugees moved. Borders hardened. Each crisis made the next crisis worse. A poor harvest is survivable. A raid is survivable. A palace intrigue is survivable. Even a destroyed city can be rebuilt. But poor harvests, raids, migration, broken trade, unpaid soldiers, and failing governments, all arriving within a few generations, can become something far more destructive than any one disaster alone. That is the most plausible interpretation of Win 77 BC. Not one mystery weapon, not one lost super army, not one volcanic eruption, earthquake, drought, or invasion that explains everything. It was a cascade. A connected world became too strained to absorb more shocks. And when the palaces failed, the systems built around them failed too. So imagine the Eastern Mediterranean after the fires. A palace courtyard stands open beneath the night sky. Its roof has fallen in, clay tablets lie buried in ash, weeds push through cracks in the stone. Somewhere beyond the abandoned walls, a small village still has smoke rising from its hearths. Families are planting what they can. Fishermen are repairing nets. Children are growing up in a world where the old kings, the old trade routes, and the old certainties have become stories. The Bronze Age did not simply end. It changed into something else. And out of that darker, smaller, more uncertain world would come new peoples, new kingdoms, iron tools, new languages, and eventually a new age. If you enjoyed drifting through this ancient mystery, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight. And if you would like to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify through the link in the description.